I'd like to call this hearing to order. Today's hearing will be the 18th day of hearings on what we refer to as the American Energy Initiative. Today we're going to be focusing primarily on the Gasoline Regulation Act of 2012, which just simply requires an interagency committee chaired by the Secretary of Energy to analyze the cumulative impacts of particular regulations on gas and diesel and the impacts that that has on fuel prices and jobs. And then the second bill that we're going to be considering is the Strategic Energy Production Act of 2012, which simply would require the Secretary of Energy, in response to any SPRO drawdown, to develop a plan with other federal departments to open additional federal lands for oil and gas exploration and production to replace the oil in the drawdown. Now I want to take just a few minutes today, start my time there, take a few minutes today to make a few comments about the proposed regulation of EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, which was announced yesterday. Now, I'm genuinely concerned about this for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it's my genuine belief that EPA has not been totally straightforward with the American people on some of its regulations recently. Specifically, I'm talking about the Utility Act is one I'll discuss first. The Utility Act was sold to the American people as necessary to reduce mercury emissions. And the impression was that the benefits of the Utility Act would come from reducing mercury emissions. And yet the data and the statistics and the analysis of EPA showed quite clearly that any benefits from reducing mercury were negligible. The primary benefits would come only from reduction of particulate matter, which is already regulated under the Clean Air Act. In addition to that, there were no accurate or comprehensive analysis of the total cost of the Utility Act. Now, we know that the purpose of it is to reduce production of electricity by using coal. But once again, I would say that I don't think that EPA was totally straightforward with the American people on that issue. Now, on the greenhouse gas regulation, proposed regulation, Congress on 3 separate occasions has said no to regulating greenhouse gas under the Clean Air Act. 221 members of Congress sent a letter to OMB, to Jeffrey Zients, asking that they delay any proposed regulation on greenhouse gas. Not only did they not reply in any way, did not respond by letter, by phone call, or anything else, totally disregarded any input from 221 members of Congress. Now, I recognize this is a proposed regulation. But if this regulation is adopted, there will not be another coal-powered plant built in America without carbon capture and sequestration, because there is no other way to meet the standard. And we know that there is no commercially viable carbon capture and sequestration applicable to any coal-powered that a coal-powered plant could use today to meet that requirement. And we're also concerned that under new source review, if you modify an existing coal-powered plant to meet existing environmental regulations, that might be claimed to be a new plant, and therefore you've got to meet this new requirement. Now, I know that there's an exception that says that is not the case, but we also know that historically lawsuits have been filed and there have been all sorts of unintended consequences as a result. And so if a lawsuit were filed of some company trying to modify an existing plant to meet existing regulations, and a decision was made that, oh, this is a new plant, then we would have a catastrophic result, I believe, in America for meeting our electricity needs. So I simply want to express my genuine concern about the way we're going on these regulations. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we're here today holding yet another hearing on high gas prices. Much like we have done numerous times in the past, and will consider continue to do many more times in the future, unless we make up our minds to fundamentally change our dependence on oil. Mr. Chairman, I support President Obama's all-of-the-above energy approach, which encompasses increased oil and gas production here in the U.S., additional conservation and energy efficiency measures, as well as a move towards cleaner and renewable sources of energy. These gas price hearings may play well in the media and may make it appear as if Congress is actually busy doing something to address rising fuel prices. But the fact of the matter is that there is little that Congress or the administration can do to drastically reduce gas prices in the immediate future. We all know, Mr. Chairman, that fuel prices are set by global supply and demand. And as long as we continue to rely so heavily on oil, especially for powering our vehicles, then we will continue to be at the mercy of OPEC and surging fuel prices driven by the insatiable demand for oil led by the emergence of India and China. Mr. Chairman, while attacking EPA regulations and shouting bumper stick slogans such as "drill, baby, drill," may be enough to fire up a small percentage of the American public, those simplistic solutions do nothing to really address the issue before us and the issue before the American people. We must strategically wean ourselves away from our oil reliance, especially in the transportation sector, as the only way we can ever steer clear of fluctuating gasoline prices that are set on the global market. And neither of the bills before us today will do anything to get at the heart of the problem. Surprise, surprise. Republicans in Congress are once again attacking the EPA and blaming the Clean Air Act as the cause for all of the problems we face in our nation today. And now that also includes rising gasoline prices. In fact, the draft legislation before us seems to directly contradict the Supreme Court's unanimous 2001 ruling that costs could not be considered in establishing air standards whose primary objective is to protect America's children, America's families, and the public health of all Americans. And despite the howls and despite the protests of the Tea Party faithful, most Americans do not blame the EPA for high gas prices, but rather blame major oil companies who made a record $137 billion in profits last year, and that these have more to do with the recent wild increases in gasoline prices. Don't blame the EPA, blame the oil companies. Maybe this belief stems from the fact that for every additional penny that the average American pay at the pump, big oil profits go up another $2 million. In light of this fact, Mr. Chairman, I will submit along with my March 15 letter requesting a hearing on speculation in the oil markets. This subcommittee should also look into the impact that rising gasoline prices have on big oil profits as compared to the pocketbook of ordinary American families. At least then, Mr. Chairman, at that hearing, we will be actually looking into the practices that the American people really do believe are behind the rising fuel prices. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, who is the author of our Strategic Energy Production Act of 2012, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. Our country runs on abundant, affordable energy. It's the energy that fuels our factories, our farms, and ultimately drives our economy forward. Each of us here today understands that rising gas prices are impeding the growth of our economy. Without lower gas prices, families, businesses will spend more and more of their income filling up with a tank of gas instead of investing into our economy. So I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the country's economic recovery is at risk if we continue with the status quo. Which brings me to the subject at hand, why we need to develop energy on federal lands and why the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPRO, should not be drawn down when there are many longer-term, more lasting ways to address the problem of higher gas prices. Mr. Chairman, many in this administration and beyond have suggested that tapping the SPRO is the way to bring down prices. While this may be politically expedient during an election year, no one can argue with the fact that it is a one-time, short-term political fix to an enduring problem. The SPRO is intended to be used during times of severe energy disruptions, like shutdowns or major natural disasters. And I think we can all agree that, fortunately, we don't find ourselves having to deal with either of those situations today. What we are experiencing, however, is extraordinarily high gas prices, and we need real solutions in order to bring them down. What baffles me is that the federal government has resources to alleviate the problem, but it refuses to use them. While production on the whole is up, production on federal lands is down. In fact, only 3% of all public land is now leased for oil and gas production. The vast amounts of oil that we are unable to access are lying fallow until we allow energy production companies to develop them. The Strategic Energy Production Act in front of us today provides that if the President decides to draw down oil from the SPRO, a plan must be in place to increase leases on federal lands. It's as simple as that. If there's a supply shortage severe enough to warrant tapping our reserves, then we should do all we can to address it. Why not make more lands available for production or streamline procedures by which we can access federal land for production? Why address this problem with a short-term fix when we all know it's a long-term problem? We should address this problem with good policy, not quick-fix politics. It is time we take some proactive steps in promoting domestic energy production and stop playing politics with an issue as serious as this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to associate myself with what you just said, and I also want to associate myself with what Chairman Whitfield just said about the recent issuance of regulations regarding emissions of coal-fired power plants. Chairman Whitfield couldn't be more right in his concern about that. Today is the 18th hearing in a day about America's energy policy. I understand that because of jurisdictional issues, the Energy and Commerce Committee can't be involved in every legislative issue regarding energy, but I'd like to put before the committee for its consideration a plan that I think would address the high gasoline prices over time. I think the first thing that we'd have to do is reform federal land permitting issues. When it takes the Texas Railroad Commission days to issue a permit and it takes the various federal agencies years, that's a problem. And it's not that Texas is too fast, it's that the federal government drags its feet. The Obama administration has shown repeatedly that they really do not want, in spite of the rhetoric, to encourage domestic oil and gas production anywhere in America on federal lands. We need to take a look at those permitting practices and I think legislatively address them. As Chairman Whitfield and Mr. Gardner have just pointed out, we also need to look at the various environmental regulations and how they impact energy production and energy use. Chairman Whitfield's draft bill is a step in the right direction. It may not be the end-all, be-all, but at least it is an attempt to look at some of those negative regulatory impact. Something that really hasn't been mentioned but needs to be is we need to encourage the use of more natural gas for transportation uses. There's absolutely no reason when natural gas is $2.30 in MCF and oil is over $100 a barrel that we can't find a way to use more natural gas for transportation issues. Finally, we need to encourage the use of new technologies for oil and gas production in America. Hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and CO2 injection into depleted fields all have potential to increase domestic energy production in the midterm. We're currently producing about 8 million barrels of oil. We could, I think, produce double that amount in the next 10 years if we use those technologies in an environmentally safe fashion. There's absolutely no reason that America can't be energy independent, Mr. Chairman, if we want to, and with your leadership and Chairman Upton's leadership and the leadership of the Republican majority in the House, I think we can work with the rest of this Congress to begin to make that a potential reality in the near term. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to welcome back to our committee a previous member and now again a member, Congressman Sarbanes from the state of Maryland. He was a very energetic member before, and I'm sure he will make a real contribution now that he's back on our committee. Now, if I could get the clock, I'll start my opening statement. I want to comment on the Chairman's statement about EPA's regulation. I want to congratulate EPA on the carbon power plant regulation. It's required by the law, and it's a good regulation, and I think it makes a lot of sense to protect our environment and for our economy. Today we're examining the Republicans' response to gasoline prices. It's not an encouraging occasion for America's families who are faced with rising costs at the pump. The discussion drafts before us are not based in economic principle or sound policy. The policies haven't been publicly recommended to us by any knowledgeable or authoritative body. These bills are a package of half-baked ideas and giveaways to the oil industry. They're based on false premises. These are not solutions to the real problems that Americans are struggling with. Republicans have two answers to gasoline prices at $4 per gallon. First, they propose drilling for more oil. Yet every economist and oil market expert tells us that this will have no meaningful impact on oil prices, which are set on a global market. Just look north to Canada. Canadians drill plenty of oil. They are energy independent and they export to us. But this doesn't bring them lower prices. In fact, their gasoline prices are higher than ours due to taxes. We'll also hear today that Republicans can bring down gasoline prices by blocking environmental regulations that protect Americans from dangerous air pollution. No one should be fooled by this argument. Under Republican leadership, this body has become the most anti-environmental Congress in history. Since January 2011, the House Republicans have voted more than 200 times to undermine the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other environmental laws. The premise of this legislation is that we're going to have before us today, that high gas prices are caused by EPA regulations that haven't even been proposed. That's a complete fantasy. High gasoline prices are being caused by rising global demand, tensions in the Middle East, and tight supplies. Americans want clean air. They don't want this committee to use high gasoline prices as an excuse for blocking regulations to reduce toxic emissions from oil refineries. Americans want cars that can go further on a gallon of gasoline. This is especially important when fuel prices are high. They don't want us to use high gasoline prices as a pretext for blocking clean fuel regulations that the auto companies need to make cleaner, more efficient vehicles. But that is exactly what the legislation does. Even worse, one of the bills before us contains the latter amendment. That's a proposal that will cut the heart out of the Clean Air Act. It would overturn a unanimous 2001 Supreme Court case and repeal a 40-year-old law that says the goal of the Clean Air Act is to achieve air quality that is safe for Americans to breathe. On our first panel today, we'll hear from the administration on gas prices. There is no silver bullet to gasoline prices, but the actions federal agencies are taking show that President Obama is charting the course for an economy that is built to last. EPA will tell us how they've adopted rules that save consumers money at the pump and decrease the nation's oil demand. The Department of Interior will tell us how American oil production has increased to levels we haven't seen in recent memory. And the Department of Energy will explain how they are researching and developing the clean energy options that will lessen our dependence on oil and our vulnerability to price spikes going forward. Instead of supporting these valuable initiatives, the Republican-controlled House has done everything possible to frustrate them. The House has passed partisan legislation to prevent the administration from cutting tailpipe emissions and making vehicles more efficient. The Republican budget could decimate the funding for clean energy, and House Republicans have even opposed efforts to penalize oil companies that sit on oil leases and refuse to produce any oil until prices go higher. If we really cared about helping the country become more resilient to gasoline price volatility, we would be working with the administration instead of trying to block President Obama's every initiative. But this hearing isn't about understanding and addressing gasoline prices. It's about using high gasoline prices as yet another rationale for advancing a profoundly anti-environmental agenda. Oil companies will surely benefit if these bills are enacted, and just as surely American families will suffer.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. That concludes opening statements, and so I would like to welcome the members of the first panel. We appreciate your being here very much, and we look forward to your testimony about these pieces of legislation as well as other issues. We have with us this morning the Honorable Gina McCarthy, who is no stranger to the subcommittee. She's the Assistant Administrator of Air and Regulation at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. We have Mr. Christopher Smith, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oil and Natural Gas, Office of Fossil Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. And then we have Mr. Robert Abbey, who is the Director, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Department of Interior. And each one of you will be given 5 minutes to make an opening statement. And Ms. McCarthy, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes to begin.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be back before you today. Many families are hard hit by today's high gas prices. They deserve and they need real solutions. Unfortunately, the Gasoline Act of 2012 doesn't offer real solutions. It uses high gas prices as a reason to roll back fundamental public health protections that have nothing to do with high gas prices. This bill would fundamentally change the cornerstone of the Clean Air Act, the requirement that EPA set air quality standards for smog at the level that the science advises us is necessary to protect public health. Let me be clear. Programs to protect public health and to provide American families with scientifically credible information about the health of the air in their communities are not the cause of high gas prices. In contrast, EPA's actions ensure that we travel farther on each gallon of gasoline that we consume. In partnership with NHTSA, we have issued a set of proposed and final greenhouse gas pollution and fuel economy standards for model years 2011 to 2025, vehicles that will save approximately 12 billion barrels of oil over the life of those vehicles. That's equivalent to the past 6 years of imported oil from OPEC countries. Consumers are already saving money at the pump as a result of these rules. In model year 2025, vehicles will save their owners $3,000 to $4,400 over the life of that vehicle. EPA and NHTSA's recent standards for trucks and buses will also save money. For example, a long-haul trucker would save a net of $73,000 over the life of a model year 2018 truck. In addition, EPA's Renewable Fuels Program, when fully implemented, will displace about 7% of expected annual U.S. gasoline and diesel consumption in 2022. The Gasoline Regulation Act of 2012 would not reduce gas prices, but it would waste government resources and taxpayer dollars. It would unnecessarily delay EPA rules that would protect public health in cost-effective ways in order to allow a new interagency committee to conduct cumulative analysis of rules. Only it's not clear how the committee would analyze rules that haven't even been proposed, or how the public could comment on that analysis in an informed way. And this analysis is simply not needed to ensure that EPA analyzes the effects of our rules on gas prices. We do that already. Most troubling, however, is a provision unrelated to gas prices. Section 6 would roll back one of the key public health protections in the Clean Air Act. It would fundamentally alter the way that EPA would set the national ambient air quality standard for ozone or smog. For many people, including 1 out of every 10 school-age children, elevated ozone levels can make it harder to breathe. Ozone exacerbates the suffering of asthmatics, causing more frequent and severe asthma attacks. So people with compromised health conditions like asthma have come to rely on EPA's daily air quality index to help them manage their lives. The elderly skip their morning walk on bad air days, and mothers keep their kids indoors when the air is not sufficiently protective for their children to breathe. What will happen if this bill should pass and we have to do what Section 6 tells us to do? We would no longer rely on the science to identify bad air days, and instead we would have to decide what level of smog is protective of public health based on what's cost-effective and feasible to address. Again, let me be clear, I'm not saying that we should not take cost and feasibility into consideration when we determine the most appropriate actions to take to achieve health-based standards like smog. We do. But I am saying that we should not let our economists weigh in on what is and is not healthy air. That's the job of scientists and health experts, and I, for one, would like to keep it that way. In conclusion, the draft bill would do nothing to address high gas prices, but it would delay significant cost-effective health protections required under the Clean Air Act and undermine EPA's authority to protect public health and the environment by rolling back a fundamental Clean Air Act public health protections. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I heard your concerns about the recent announcement by EPA on carbon pollution standards for future power plants. I'm more than happy to come and return at a time when you might have a hearing on that or to answer any questions you may have today.
Thank you. This time, I recognize Mr. Smith for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Energy's perspective on these two legislative proposals. We share the concern of members regarding the burden that rising gasoline prices place on U.S. families and businesses. For decades, volatile energy prices have threatened the economic security for millions of American households, hitting consumers hard and straining budgets for millions of American families. The American people understand that there is no silver bullet for meeting our energy needs and bringing down the price of gasoline in the short term. In the long term, though, we can work to protect America from the ups and downs of the global market by pursuing a sustained, all-of-the-above approach to American energy that will reduce oil imports, save families and businesses money at the pump, and position the United States as the leader in clean energy alternatives. As part of this comprehensive energy strategy, the United States is expanding oil production here at home, increasing the efficiency of the vehicles that we drive, and investing in advanced technologies that will diversify our transportation sector. The Obama administration is committed to expanding the safe and responsible production of America's energy resources, which is one reason why the U.S. production has increased each year the President has been in office. Domestic oil production is currently at an 8-year high, and there are more oil rigs operating now in the United States than in the rest of the world combined. At the same time, America's dependence on foreign oil has been going down over the last several years. In 2010, imported oil accounted for less than 50% of the oil consumed here in the United States for the first time in 13 years. But exploration alone will not solve our energy challenges. That is why the administration is working to improve vehicle efficiency. The administration has announced historic standards that will nearly double the fuel economy of the vehicles we drive, saving families approximately $1.7 trillion at the pump and cutting oil consumption by 12 billion barrels. The administration is also investing in advanced vehicles and fuels, including targeted investments in electric and natural gas vehicles, advanced combustion engines, biofuels and fuel blends, and advanced and lighter materials for vehicles that will help reduce the amount of gas American families will need to buy. Domestic natural gas also has the potential as an alternative transportation fuel, especially for long-haul trucks. At the Department of Energy, we are investing in research into natural gas-powered vehicles to further reduce our dependence on imported oil. The Department of Energy has serious concerns about the legislation being discussed today. These bills would do little or nothing to address the current situation facing American families and businesses, and in fact could potentially make the tools that we do have available to protect U.S. energy security less effective. Drawdowns of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve have been used in the past to offset the loss of crude oil supplies and mitigate the impacts to the nation of oil supply interruptions and the resulting price spikes. The Strategic Energy Production Act of 2012, if enacted, will make it more difficult for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to achieve its mission to respond promptly to supply interruptions with emergency crude oil. Drawdowns are already a complicated process involving coordination with a variety of local, regional, and international entities. Imposing a requirement to coordinate future increases in leased federal lands as a consequence of releasing crude from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would require a significant expansion of the resources at the Department of Energy and other departments, and would have a negative impact on the decision-making process to employ the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which should be based solely on protecting the United States from the consequences of severe supply interruptions. Similarly, the other piece of legislation being discussed today, the discussion draft of the Gas Regulations Act of 2012, would require a large investment of resources from the Department of Energy and other federal agencies participating on the committee, and would be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish in the time frame mandated in the legislation. The administration shares this committee's concern about the burden caused by high gasoline prices. However, we do not believe that the bills we are discussing today would help achieve the intended purpose. Creating more bureaucratic structures and complicating the government's decision-making process are not the means of best responding to spikes in gasoline prices and reducing our dependence on imported oil. We remain committed to working with Congress on ways to constructively address our nation's energy challenges. Thank you again for having me here today, and I look forward to addressing any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Abbey, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to appear before you this morning to discuss the Department of Interior's role in the administration's plan for our domestic energy future. We understand that this subcommittee is considering a discussion draft of legislation which would link oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters to the authorization by the President of a drawdown of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And while we defer to the Energy Department, which is the lead agency on this issue, for a position on the legislation, the planning and leasing processes currently in place at the Department of Interior are already resulting in a broad energy strategy that is reducing our dependence on foreign oil. We know that prices at the pump are high and that there is no simple solution to bring down that price. This is why the President and the Department of Interior has continued to promote and implement an all-of-the-above approach to American energy. The BLM is responsible for managing our national system of public lands, which are located primarily in the 12 western states, including Alaska. The BLM administers over 245 million surface acres, more than any other federal agency, and approximately 700 million acres of onshore subsurface mineral estate throughout the nation. The Bureau of Land Management plays an important role in advancing domestic energy production on these America's public lands. Domestic oil and gas production from the public lands remain critical to our energy supply. But we're also expanding development of renewable energy sources like wind and solar and geothermal production that will help diversify our nation's energy portfolio. Onshore, there are now over 38 million acres under lease for oil and gas, but less than one-third, about 32% of that acreage, is currently in production. Companies also continue to hold thousands of approved but unused permits to drill on our public lands. Expanding safe and responsible oil and gas production from the Outer Continental Shelf is a key component of the President's blueprint for a secure energy future, and will help us continue to reduce our dependence on foreign oil and create jobs here at home. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, manages the nation's offshore energy and mineral resources in a balanced way that promotes efficient and environmentally responsible oil and gas and renewable energy development, and a commitment to rigorous, science-based environmental review and study. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's 5-year oil and gas leasing program is a key element in managing our offshore oil and gas assets. Under these statutory requirements, the Department prepares a long-range program that specifies the size, timing, and location of areas to be considered for federal offshore oil and gas leasing. The proposed Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas leasing programs for 2012 through 2017 includes substantial acreage for lease in regions with known potential for oil and gas development. This plan makes areas containing more than 75% of undiscovered, technically recoverable oil and gas resources in the federal OCS available for exploration and development. BOEM has also established a regulatory framework for renewable energy leasing and development. Recently, BOEM has taken a number of important steps toward additional lease sales in fiscal year 2013 and beyond, including developing a commercial lease form, conducting an analysis to determine auction formats, and completing an environmental assessment to support leasing in wind energy areas off 4 mid-Atlantic states. Recognizing that America's oil supplies are limited, we must develop our domestic resources safely, responsibly, and efficiently, while at the same time taking steps that will ultimately lessen our reliance on oil. We're also taking steps both onshore and offshore to encourage industry to develop the thousands of leases and permits that they already have, but that are currently sitting idle. The Obama administration and the Department of Interior are working to secure our energy future by ensuring that our domestic oil and gas resources are safely developed and that the potential for clean energy development on our public lands and water is realized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before this subcommittee.
Thank you. We appreciate the opening statement of all of you. And Ms. McCarthy, I know you all have got a lot going on over at EPA, but we have a policy of asking that opening statements be given to us 48 hours before the hearing. And I know a lot of people are surprised at this, but we actually read these opening statements. And yesterday we received yours at 6:25 last night, which was certainly way beneath the 48-hour. So I would hope that in the future, if you could get to us 48 hours in advance, we'd really appreciate that.
Mr. Chairman, I will do my best in the future. We had some difficulty because we didn't receive the draft legislation until last week. So, but we will do our best in the future. Okay.
Yeah. And second of all, recently you gave a speech to the Coal Club here in Washington, D.C., and in that speech you had indicated that there were hundreds of utility plants that could meet the existing utility plants that could meet the Utility Act regulations, and you indicated that you would make that list available to anyone that wanted it. And our staff has asked your staff to provide that list to us, and we have not received it yet. And since the implication was that you all certainly had that list, could you provide that to us by the end of the day today?
Mr. Chairman, I did attend the meeting that you identified. I did misspeak. There are dozens of facilities that actually achieve the existing standards, and we're more than happy to respond to the request.
Well, could we have it by the end of the day?
I don't know if I can accommodate that, but I will get back to you by the
well,
end of the
because
day.
your staff had indicated to us that we need to write a letter, so I'm just going to ask you verbally if you could get it to us by the end of the day, if possible, the list of 12 or so plants that meet that existing.
It's dozens. It's in the 60s, but I will do my best to get that to you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to ask all of you, yes or no, has the EPA or Department of Energy or Department of Interior taken a position on these two pieces of legislation? Mr. Smith, have y'all taken a position on them?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. So on the first piece of legislation that has to deal with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we do have some concerns about the idea of tying the operational capability of one of the few quick response tools that the federal government actually does have to respond to emergency supply disruptions that could cause price spikes for American consumers, and taking that and tying it to a regulatory, legal, legislative process by which we're trying to estimate new quantities of oil and gas to be produced on public lands in cooperation with private oil companies. So we have some concerns about that.
So you're not opposed to it at this point, but you have some concerns that we might be able to address with you.
Well, I'd say categorically that we think that the direction of taking a strategic asset that's dedicated by statute to protecting national security by protecting against price spikes that might be caused by supply interruptions and tying it to a legislative process, that's something that we'd be categorically against.
Now, Mr. Abbey, what about your department?
Mr. Chairman, we have deferred to the Department of Energy to take a position on that particular legislative proposal. But I will say this, that we believe such a proposal is unnecessary.
And Ms. McCarthy, has EPA taken a formal position?
No, sir, we don't.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you had mentioned in your comment was that this legislation appears to use high gas prices as the reason to roll back fundamental public health protections. And I would just say and clarify that this legislation on the gas issue does not roll back anything. It simply defers 3 rules for at least 6 months after the issuance of a final report: the Tier 3 motor vehicle emission and fuel standards, the new source performance standard for petroleum refineries, which is not out there yet, and the new ozone standards, which are not out there. So it was not the intent of this legislation to roll back any existing health protections.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. The rollback comment was related to the requirement that we change from being advised by the science in terms of what's protective as a standard for smog, as opposed to take into consideration cost and feasibility, which would significantly change the fundamental premise of the Clean Air Act.
Well, I would just say that the President himself wrote a letter to Administrator Jackson in which he directed that you minimize regulatory costs and burdens. He wrote that letter September 2nd, 2011. My time's expired. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for... Oh, Mr. Sarbanes was here first, I was told. Recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to be back here on the committee. Appreciate the opportunity.
Let me just say we welcome you back, and thank you.
Thanks very much. Ms. McCarthy, I wanted to address most of my questions to you. First of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for your testimony, and thanks for the work that you do at the EPA. I thought since I was returning to the committee that I ought to get back to core principles and understanding the mission of the EPA, so I looked again this morning at the mission of the EPA, which is to protect human health and the environment. And the first purpose listed for the EPA is its purpose is that all Americans, to ensure that all Americans are protected from significant risks to human health and the environment where they live, learn, and work. And I commend you for bringing our attention to Section 6 of the Act that's under review here today, because I agree with you that it creates a dangerous it's a dangerous development to start putting aside the concerns about the science in developing the standards. And as I understand it from what you said, that's your concern. It's not that we throw economics completely out the window, but when it comes to developing the standards that you want to put forward that are designed to protect human health and the environment, you need to rely on the science first and foremost, and your fear, based on this provision, is that that would be trumped by these other concerns. So I thank you for bringing that up. I come from Maryland, and I'm concerned about the fact that Maryland, I think, is one of the, well, Baltimore has been found to have one of the highest levels of smog on the East Coast, Baltimore and Washington. That's the corridor I travel every day. So I'm very, very interested in the potential of these Tier 3 tailpipe pollution standards, which are coming along to address pollution in our area. And what I'd like you to do, if you could, and I understand that standards aren't developed yet, the regulations have not been issued. I'm concerned about any effort to get in the way of the timeline for those, because we have great expectations of what they can, how they can benefit Maryland and, frankly, the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed. But if you could speak to the health benefits behind these new Tier 3 tailpipe pollution standards in terms of reducing nitrogen oxides, and what that means in terms of the public health, I'd appreciate it very much.
Mr. Congressman, first let me congratulate Maryland for all the work they do. I know that we work with them very closely on issues of ozone. There are many rules that we have done that are attempting to address the interstate transport of ozone into Maryland, where you're working very hard. On Tier 3 in particular, the importance of Tier 3 is very large to states like yours and others that deal with smog. And it will produce vehicles that will significantly lower both VOCs and NOx, which are precursors of ozone. They will also provide significant net benefits related to lower sulfur in gasoline. So while the rules haven't been proposed, our major concern here is that we'd be having to wait for the completion of a report that may never come. In this rule, this new law would actually tell us that we had to wait for 6 years for the completion of a rule that will provide no further clear information to the public on our Tier 3 rule, and our rule hasn't even been proposed. It's not clear how it would be analyzed, and we want to move on and get it in front of the public and provide the benefits that the Clean Air Act intended. And it is a significant way for us to reduce ozone and to provide those public health protections.
I appreciate that, and I want to anticipate, you know, in the context of this hearing, the criticism would be that those new tailpipe emission standards would significantly increase the cost of gasoline. In fact, the studies that I have available to me, and I'm looking at a very good article from the Baltimore Sun last November, suggests, based on industry forecasts, that you might increase fuel costs by a half cent, potentially half cent to a cent. And you're looking at, you know, all told, maybe $143 million increased costs, up to potentially $400. You look at the benefits in terms of reduced health care costs because of reducing the pollution out there, and you're talking about, and this is reducing hospitalizations, 6 days, and premature deaths, and you're looking at $234 million to $1.2 billion saved. So that's really something we should take into consideration. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Ms. McCarthy, yesterday the EPA put out proposed regulations on new coal-fired power plants. It allows the emission of CO2 to be, I think, 1,000 pounds per ton. Most coal-fired power plants, the average, I think, is about 1,700 pounds of CO2 per ton. Where did 1,000 pounds per ton come from, and what's magic about it?
The standard is 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour.
Per megawatt, I'm sorry, you're right,
that's
per
okay.
megawatt hour.
And it is based on what we believe to be the best system of emission reduction, is what's called in the law. It's based on natural gas combined cycle, which is about 95% of the natural gas combined cycle units that have been built since 2005 actually achieve this 1,000-pound standard.
But that's natural gas.
It is, but we also recognize that most new units are actually going to be natural gas. That's the trend we see because of the availability and cost.
You understand that if you set the standard for coal at that range, you're not going to build a new coal-fired power plant. You understand that.
We identified a pathway for coal to achieve by providing flexibility to allow coal a 30-year averaging to achieve that standard, recognizing that carbon capture and storage, while it's available today, they may not want to put or design the facility to have it today, but they could over a 30-year period and achieve the
Carbon
standard.
capture works in the laboratory, but when you scale it up to put it on a real power plant, it raises the cost by about 30%, or at least it did the last time I looked at it. So what you've done is effectively say we're not going to use coal to generate electricity in the United States ever again. Is the EPA and President Obama comfortable with that, that you're just wiping out half the generation capacity of America for electricity currently?
We believe that carbon capture and sequestration is actually being put on at full scale now. We believe that the 50% capture rate, which is very modest for today's systems, can be achieved and allow this averaging to be a very successful approach to coal continuing to be developed. And we recognize that over time, the cost and effectiveness of that technology will likely improve dramatically. The 30-year horizon gives units 10 years to actually, before they need to install carbon capture and sequestration in order to make that standard within that 30-year period.
I don't think it's a surprise to you that many of us don't share the optimism that you just expressed about the ability for technology to overcome that, and I wouldn't be surprised if you don't see some legislative attempts to correct the proposed regulation. I want to ask Mr. Abbey about permitting reform on federal lands. As I pointed out in my opening statement, in Texas, the Railroad Commission on occasion will issue a new permit for an oil or gas well within a day, but it almost always never takes more than a week. I can't find a record of a federal permit on federal lands or the OCS being issued, and the average is 3 years. Some take as long as 7 years. Do you agree that federal permitting reform for oil and gas leases should be a priority to enact?
It is a priority for the Department of Interior to look at our existing processes and always determine where improvement could be achieved and efficiencies achieved so that we can move forward as expeditiously as possible to review the applications that come before us and make decisions on those applications.
What would be a good goal to shoot for?
Well, again, it would be difficult to assign a goal to each application because they vary from complexity, by complexity. But let me just share with you.
How about let's do it in less than a year?
Well, many of them are approved, are decisions made within a year. For example, last year we received approximately 41 applications for permits to drill within the Bureau of Land Management. We made decisions. We issued approvals on over 4,200 applications for permits to drill because we ended up addressing some of the backlog that we had carried over from the previous year. So when the industry says
it's 3 to 7 years, they're just not telling the truth?
Some applications will require that much time because we go back and have to do an environmental impact statement, but many of the applications, most of the applications that we do receive for permits to drill are decided within probably anywhere between 90 days to a year.
Okay. My time's expired, but I'd like to ask Ms. McCarthy one final question. Could you elaborate on Lisa Jackson, the administrator, Ms. Jackson's announcement yesterday that the EPA had no plans to issue regulations for greenhouse gases for existing power plants? What is no plans? Is that the next week, the next year, the next decade? Could you elaborate a little bit on her announcement on that issue?
I think her statement, Congressman, was very clear. We do not have plans to develop new source performance standards for existing
So
facilities.
I can state that for the rest of the Obama administration, Lisa Jackson and the EPA is not going to issue a regulation for existing power plants on greenhouse gases.
We just indicated that we have no plan.
For the rest of the Obama administration.
Right now, we are focused solely on what you've already proposed, which is getting comment on the new source standard, which is the premise for moving forward. We are looking forward to those comments, and we want to make sure that we get the new source performance standard right, that we protect existing facilities at this point, and should we move forward with existing in the future, that would be a standard that would be established through separate rulemaking.
So no plans is like President Clinton saying depends on what the definition is.
Expired. Gentleman's time expired. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to follow my colleague from Texas, and if I run over, could I get a couple minutes too, although I'm not a chairman emeritus of the committee. So that was a quick response. Ms. McCarthy, following my colleague from Texas, I appreciate what you did on the existing facilities, because that was a big concern. Now, we may still have some discussion on how we can do sequestration or things on existing facilities, but my interest is obviously refining capacity. And my understanding, the EPA has publicly stated it will propose the Tier 3 sulfur standards this March, which would mean they would need to be proposed this week. When do you plan to propose those Tier 3 sulfur standards?
We don't have an exact timeline at this point, Congressman. We are actively looking at this issue. We want to assure that they're as cost-effective as they can be. Right now, we project that cost to be somewhere less than a penny. We recognize the challenges associated with the cost of gasoline, and we're going to be sensitive to that. Okay.
And since you don't have a timeline, I know you'd agree that in using the same rationale that you used on greenhouse gases for new permitting, the combination of these rules could put refiners in quite a predicament. And so I would hope that you're working with, I understand you're working with litigants and seeing what we can do, because obviously everybody wants to do what's right, but we need to be able to capitalize it, and particularly on refineries like I have. I have 5 of them that are very large, and they just don't, I mean, at any given time there's a permit for something in the works there in East Harris County, so I appreciate that. Let me ask Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, I have some concerns in the discussion draft that our colleague, Mr. Gardner, has with interfere with the efficient management and operation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, maybe make it unusable. In fact, the proposal covers not just drawdowns and sales, but also exchange agreements. The authority entering an exchange agreement with private companies has been used 10 times, and these exchanges allow refiners to overcome unforeseen emergency disruptions in their crude oil supply. In June of 2000, this authority was used because of a commercial dry dock collapse in the shipping channel in Louisiana, blocking the primary route of the 2 refineries. If not for the exchange, these refineries would have had to halt production. In 2006, an accidental release of stormwater and oil caused another ship channel closure, again blocking the supply to 2 refineries. Again, the exchange from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve kept these refineries running. In my district, I have a number of refineries that depend on the Houston Ship Channel. A closure of that channel could be devastating for these companies and their workers, not to mention the economy that depends on their fuel. My question is, Ms. Smith, do the requirements of the Congressman Gardner's bill apply to exchanges from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, such as the ones that were done to address ship channel closures in 2000 and 2006?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I can't speak to the details of exchanges. Just simply, I'm not familiar with that clause of the regulation. What I can say is that anything in the regulation that is going to restrict the ability for us to use the National Petroleum Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a way that protects national security and in a way that allows us to respond to emergency disruptions in supply that might cause price spikes for American consumers would be something that's going to be taking away a primary tool that the federal government does have, that's its exposure to protect American consumers, and it would be something that would not be in the best interest of the American public.
So would an exchange from just one refinery to address an emergency disruption trigger the requirement to create a leasing plan?
Well, my understanding is that exchanges are covered, John.
Okay. In June of 2000, exchange I mentioned early on, it was only 500,000 barrels. Right. That's less than 1/10 of 1% of the holdings of the SPRO. Ms. Smith, would this bill require you to create a nationwide leasing plan because of the exchange of less than 1/10 of 1% of the SPRO, and the plan would have to increase leasing of federal land by less than 1/10 of 1%?
Well, my understanding of the legislation that, as it's proposed, is that the drawdown to the SPRO would be tied, the utilization of the SPRO would be tied to the requirement to create plans to increase production on public lands, which would involve working with all the regulatory and legal authorities and estimates of private companies that would be producing on the private lands.
I don't want any confusion. I want us to lease on public lands everywhere we can. And, but I also know that if we tie it to the SPRO, there are some emergencies that happen. Indeed. And we know in our district what happened when Hurricane Ike came into the Houston Ship Channel. Right. We had to shut down those refineries, and literally the price of oil went up, price of gasoline went up until we could get them up, and we had airline companies and DOD saying we need to get those refineries back up. So I worry that if we have a disruption, that we need to have the SPRO on a short-term basis in some cases to help.
Well,
so,
I mean, just to be clear about the response, you know, we are certainly in favor of having that flexibility to respond should need be, and we're also in favor of, generally speaking, making sure we've got an efficient process to produce oil and gas on public lands. The tying of the two together is something that would make us less effective.
Thank you.
I just want, for the record, my ranking member of my subcommittee did get like 38 additional seconds, so that's right. Thank you, and I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. McCarthy, I really do personally respect you and have great admiration for your work, but you all are just killing us in Southern Illinois. Our coal miners and our electricity generation by coal. So I have a couple questions. Under the new standards, if a power producer were to build a new coal-fired power plant, what would that cost be?
Mr. Chairman, we're talking about the greenhouse gas standard now.
Right.
Well, we took a look, frankly, and there is anticipated no proposals for coal-fired at this point in time, but we did take a look at it. We looked at the costs and benefits.
Well, we did the calculations based upon your own numbers. Your inventory greenhouse gases says this fossil fuel electricity generation emitted 2,154 million metric tons of CO2 in 2009. Your report, interagency report, says that would cost between 60 to 90 per ton in CO2 avoided. And if we assume 50% carbon capture, it would cost between $64 to $102 billion to replace our existing coal-fired generation with new plants using CCS. We'd be happy. We have economists. We'll be happy to share those numbers with you, but those are the costs incurred. Let me go to another question.
Just for clarity, this has to do with future power plants.
That's right. If we're going to replace our current ones with future power plants, under your standards, it'll cost 64 to $102 billion, based upon your numbers. Now, let's go to the second question. In the analysis, EPA assumes that nobody would want to build a new coal-fired plant. Is that correct?
That's the modeling done by EIA.
Right. So you're saying no one's going to build one anyway. In fact, I've got your all's quote here that says we don't think anybody's going to do it with these additional costs incurred.
Not at this point in time, Congressman, because of the availability and price of natural.
Isn't it a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you issue rules that nobody could meet, that we won't have electricity generation by coal?
One of the reasons why we created a 30-year window was to ensure that there was a pathway forward.
Well, at 64 to 102 billion dollars, there is no pathway forward. Let me go. Coal is our most abundant source of low-cost domestic energy. How is taking coal out of our energy mix consistent with the all-of-the-above energy strategy?
EPA is not preventing either the continued use or the construction of new coal.
Okay, Mr. Barton sent a letter, asked a letter. Department of Energy responded in May 28, 2009, and I quote, "Timeframes for undertaking a project vary depending upon the scale and complexity of the project, with smaller scale projects typically lasting 3 to 4 years in duration, and larger scale, near commercial scale, this is for carbon capture and sequestration projects taking 10-plus years to complete. Now, I'm in one of the largest areas where carbon capture and sequestration is thought to be able to do it, and we're not there. No one's going to go there. Also, on the DOE letter, it says a legal framework is needed to provide certainty in having to deal with ownership of the geological pore space. That's never going to happen. So to think we're going to move to carbon capture and sequestration, it's just very frustrating. This administration had promised before the election that they were going to bankrupt coal. And if I could run the YouTube clip. Come on, volume. Okay, what the president is, keep going, keep trying. What the problem, this is to the San Francisco Chronicle, and the president basically said
it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted. That will also generate billions of dollars.
Cut it off.
That we can.
So the issue is his goal was to bankrupt coal generation, electricity generation by coal. And it's not just greenhouse gases. Mr. Barton was correct. Greenhouse gases is the challenge next. What is the electricity generation by coal challenges now? Boiler MAC, Mercury MAC, transport rule, coal ash. So, yeah, let's put a new burden on future generation, but you're not admitting the burden that's closing down coal-fired power plants today. So you're already taking the ones out today through current regulation. You're going to take out the next generation of coal through greenhouse gas. My time's expired. I yield back.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Castor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, wait. Mr. Rush is back. So, Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see you got very excited there, but you was excited as much ado about nothing. I mean, what was the president speaking of? You were trying to insinuate. You're taking a brief 3 or 4 words out of total context of what he was saying, and Mr. Chairman, that's.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I won't yield.
It's 3.5 minutes.
No, that is the way that your side continues to operate. Take a few words that the president say, take it out of context, and then start attacking it in the context that you want to place it in, and start attacking him on those few words. I'm sure that the president wasn't talking about all the coal plants. He was talking about the most egregious polluters. And I'm not going, but I just want to make a point that's totally out of line with fairness. That's totally out of line with the way I would think that the chair would operate. And Mr. Chairman, I just think that that's very malicious on your part, because it did not. Those comments were taken out of totally out of context. Totally out of context. Ms. McCarthy. What would the health implications be of compelling the EPA to consider costs when setting health-based standards?
The implication would be that science and the advice of the scientists and health experts would no longer be the primary and sole way in which the Clean Air Act defines the goals that it's trying to achieve to protect the public and deliver clean air.
Would implementing this bill help reduce the prices at the pump?
As far as I can see, it will have no impact on the price of the pump. For the most part, the rules that it is delaying have not even been proposed, so they could not possibly be influencing the price of gasoline today.
So again, this is much ado about nothing as far as what we're going through here today, and these are my comments. I'm going to ask you this question. As relates to this hearing and what we're attempting to do in terms of blaming the EPA and the administration for the rising the prices at the pump. The bill also blocks the EPA from setting new Tier 3 emissions standards for motor vehicles and gasoline. Some may argue that the current standards are sufficient and that air quality has improved enough. Why do we need to consider additional Tier 3 standards?
Tier 3 standards would deliver needed and required public health protections to deliver cleaner fuel that's lower in sulfur, and also to ensure that vehicles continued to ratchet down the amount of NOx and VOC emissions. It's also providing fuels that will allow new technologies to enter into the market, technologies that the car companies are looking to deliver to the American people so that we have cleaner, more efficient vehicles.
In the absence of Tier 3 standards, how will states and localities achieve the emission reductions needed to achieve clean and healthy air?
Tier 3 is going to be one of the most cost-effective methods of delivering public health protections to the American public. If they're denied those protections, then they will have to look at other potentially much more costly ways of achieving those reductions that are necessary to protect their health.
And in these present economic environment and the plight of states and local governments, do you think that that's prudent, or would that be, is that would that be part of the problem or part of the solution in your opinion?
I think it's safe to say our partners at the states, local communities, and the tribes are looking to the federal government to deliver for them just these types of rules that deliver significant public health protections at very, very, very low cost.
So how would Tier 3 standards affect the price of gasoline?
From what we can tell in the policies that we're looking at now, because the rule hasn't been proposed, we are estimating a cost at less than a penny a gallon.
The Gasoline Regulations Act does nothing to guarantee lower gasoline prices or reduce our dependence on oil. What it does is guarantee is Americans will continue to breathe polluted air. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess. Dr. Burgess, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, your testimony that you provided us this morning, reading the start of one of the paragraphs, it says the Obama administration is committed to expanding the safe and responsible production of America's energy resources. And let me just say I wholeheartedly concur. I congratulate the President for being correct on this and congratulate him on espousing this as a policy that he wishes to push forward. The second part of your statement, though, confuses me. It says, which is one reason why U.S. oil production has increased each year the President has been in office. The President's been in office a little over 3 years. We sat in this committee room for a whole day in 2008 and heard a hearing on speculation, the effect on oil prices. 2008, you recall, prices were very high, similar to what we're seeing this year. And we heard testimony that day that it wouldn't do any good to drill, because if you drilled today, you wouldn't see anything for 4 to 7 years. Now, I will submit that if we drilled 4 years ago, maybe then we would be seeing something happen now, but hard to see how your two statements are true and related if indeed you want to take credit for what the President has implemented. That credit is actually going to accrue a few years from now, not today. Is that not correct?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. A couple of comments. First of all, I'm glad we have some agreement on
Sure.
some of the aims and
always
and
looking
goals
for
here.
areas of agreement. That's me, Mr. Bipartisan. Always looking for areas where we can get together.
That's encouraging. The second part of your question, not only are policies and practices in place that are incentivizing production and allowing companies to get to work in a way that's expeditious or creating better value for American consumers, but as you look at the activity that's going on right now, if you look at the rig count that's going on right now, not only are we producing more barrels right now, but there's actually more activity going on in the United States in terms of producing prudently to producing our domestic oil and gas resources than any time in the past.
If I may, just reclaiming my time, I live in an area of North Texas. We live on top of the Barnett Shale, and we have seen a lot of activity. Now, the activity is diminishing. The price has gone down, and dry gas production is apparently not as lucrative as gas and liquids in other parts of the state. But nevertheless, it's been an economic benefit to our part of the state. On the other hand, it's not come without a cost, and there are municipalities who've had to make some pretty tough decisions regarding where they allow the siting of these wells, where they allow drilling, how they handle the disposal of wastewater. But again, it's all on private land. None of this is developed on federal land. So I would just submit to you some of the boon we're seeing in energy production. And I'm grateful that the gas is there. I'm grateful that the cost has come down from what it was 5 and 6 years ago. At the same time, it's not been without some significant angst at the local level, because all of these things have to be managed at the local level, because again, these are not on federal land somewhere out in the wilderness. These are on private lands very near existing residential neighborhoods and very near existing development. Now, one of the presidential candidates is talking about setting a goal for gasoline prices at $2.50 a gallon. Is that realistic?
Well, Congressman, first of all, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, so I saw that boom firsthand, and as I go back and forth, I see the impact that local drilling has had, both in terms of creating jobs and creating opportunities for the people who live there, but also concerns about the fact that you're undertaking these activities in people's backyards. So there's going to be some concerns about the environmental impacts of drilling.
Which is why I would submit if we'd open up more federal lands, we could move away from where the people are and still develop the product. But be that as it may, $2.50, is that a realistic goal?
I think that
add
one
state and federal taxes to that, it's almost $3 a gallon. That's pretty modest in my opinion.
I think that what American people understand is that there's not a 1-point plan or a 5-point plan or a 10-point plan that's going to result in a big precipitous drop in gasoline prices.
I'm going to surprise you again. I agree. All of the above, all hands on deck. I think it's necessary. Administrator McCarthy, before my time expires, I've just got to ask you, in your testimony, you talk about the effect of ozone on patients who have asthma. And you and I have talked about this before. Yeah. For heaven's sakes, you've got something within your grasp to help people with asthma right now, today, because as you know, January 1st, because of the banning of glorified CFCs in asthma inhalers, no one can buy these things anymore. And asthma patients wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning without any other med. They've got no option now other than going to the emergency room and spending $1,500 to get a breathing treatment. Why cannot we have a waiver to allow existing stocks? I'm not asking for anybody to make any more, but allow existing stocks of Primatene to be sold in the drugstores until they're exhausted, just to give a little relief to those asthma patients that you profess to be so concerned about.
Congressman, we have heard nothing from FDA that indicates
no FDA, okay? We have jurisdiction over them too. I got a beef with them as well. This is your jurisdiction. Grant a waiver so existing stock, which has already been approved by the FDA, can be sold to patients today who may need this product tonight. If we cared about asthmatics, if we weren't conducting a war on asthmatics, we would allow this to happen. I've submitted a letter to the President on this. I would ask that it be made part of the record. I simply do not understand EPA's intransigence on this. It makes no sense, and people are suffering as a consequence.
Without objection, the letter will be submitted for the record.
And Mr. Shimkus asked me if I would submit it on his behalf, something for the record as well, dealing with if you want to build a coal plant, you can, but it's going to bankrupt you. Can I submit that for the record?
Without objection, so ordered. This time I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Abbey, we've been told that the proposal relating to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is about linking supply from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which I'll refer to as SPRO, to supply from domestic production. The proposal says that the bill that's being proposed says that we can't release oil from the SPRO, no matter how important the reason is, unless we also engage in a duplicative planning process to lease more federal land for oil production years down the line. The bill's sponsor has said that this bill is intended to increase production, and I quote, to match the amounts released from the reserve. However, while the proposal would interfere with operation of the SPRO, it may not achieve this goal. The bill ignores the fact that the Department of Energy has no expertise in lease sales, that lease sales may or may not be bid on by industry, and that leased land may or may not produce oil. Director Abbey, does this bill specify how much production from federal land should be increased?
It doesn't. The way, at least I interpret it, it does require us to make available more federal minerals as a result of any release from the reserve. But let me point out, as I stated in my opening remarks, we're already leasing land. Last year, the Bureau of Land Management held 32 oil and gas lease sales, offering up 4.4 million acres on approximately 1,750 parcels. Of those 1,750 parcels, 1,296 were actually leased.
Right.
We have 38 million acres already leased on onshore. We have another 38 million acres already leased on the Outer Continental Shelf. Of the 76 million acres that the Department of Interior has already leased, 50 million of those 76 million acres have not even been explored or developed at this point in time.
I want to get some certain specific things on the record. So if I could just ask you a series of questions that pretty much could be responded to with a yes or a no. Mr. Abbey, if we look at acreage leased nationwide, is there a simple calculation to find the oil and gas holdings of that acreage? In other words, are all acres of federal land equal in terms of oil and gas holdings?
They're not.
And if acreage is offered for lease, is it guaranteed that industry would bid on those leases?
No.
In recent lease sales, both onshore and off, a significant portion of offered leases have not received bids. Is that correct? I believe I just heard you say that.
Primarily on offshore.
Primarily on offshore?
Mm-hmm. And in the case of Alaska as well.
Offshore leases?
Onshore in Alaska.
Offshore and on, a significant portion of leases have not received bids.
Yes.
They're already been offered. Okay. Moving on. Assuming for the sake of argument that acreage was offered for lease and industry did bid on those leases, is it guaranteed that those leaseholders are going to drill on that land or offshore?
No.
Okay. A 1% drawdown from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would make about 7 million barrels of oil available. But it sounds like you are saying that a 1% increase in the amount of federal land offered for lease could run a gamut. It might be 10 times that, or it might be no oil at all.
I see no correlation.
So there is, in your opinion, no correlation between, there's not an equal over here and an equal over there.
No.
So this bill does not match new domestic oil and gas production to draw downs from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
I don't see how it is.
Well, I have one just comment to make, and then I'll let you, because this is your area of expertise, make any further conclusions that you'd like to. In my way of understanding this legislation, it is just not thought out. I suggest that we need to go back to the drawing board. I suggest this to the authors of the legislation, and perhaps in this subcommittee we need to hold a hearing, Mr. Chairman, on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve before we pass legislation to interfere with its management and operation. I will yield the last half minute to the director of BLM to respond.
Well, again, the Department of Interior is quite proud of the work that we're doing to support this administration, but more importantly, to support the citizens that we serve in making appropriate lands and waters available for leasing. We are making progress. As I mentioned in my statistics, there's 76 million acres that we've already leased, offshore as well as onshore. 50 million of those acres are not even being explored or developed. At the same time, we have 7,000 permits that we approved last year, that we have already approved, that are not being developed on by the industry.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time's expired. I might say that this bill does not preclude the release of oil from SPRO in the event of an emergency. It simply asks that a plan for leasing be submitted within 180 days. But this time I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that just quickly, Bureaus, there is no guarantee that if you offer land up that you'll get bids, right?
That is true.
But isn't it true that there is a guarantee that if you do not offer the land up, you will get no bids at all.
That's true.
Okay, so let's talk about the world of the possible. Do you have the slide up, please? Slide on the gas buddy. To the EPA. If you look at this slide, those of us in California, and let me just say this, wouldn't you agree that, first of all, probably one of the most successful clean air strategies that's ever been implemented, or agencies have been very successful, is the Air Resources Board in California, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I think Connecticut, you guys kind of kept an eye on us. Can you explain to me then, when we're told that oil is fungible around the world, that environmental regulations aren't affecting price, that supply doesn't affect the price, would you take a look at this graphic and explain to me, so I can explain to my citizens in California, why we have the highest price gasoline in America as a state?
I'm sorry, I don't have the information available to me to make an assumption.
Okay, well, let me just say, as somebody who is a regulator, for me to deny that our regulations didn't have some effect there, or the federal mandate of regulations haven't had effect there, or the fact that domestic supply coming from Alaska and California has dropped off dramatically, and we import 55% of our oil into California now from the Straits of Hormuz. I just think that we ought to, Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to have a hearing and try to explain what is that impact, because obviously there's some impact there, and we ought to be upfront about this. I think that is one of the things I'd like to look at. You brought up the issue of volatile organic compounds, and you used the term tailpipe emissions. Can you explain to me why the federal government at this time in our history is still operating off of tailpipe emissions rather than going to total emissions, which at California we did in the early 90s? Why are we maintaining that antiquated testing system when those of us at ARB found it grossly inadequate at reflecting real world emissions?
Just a second. I'm sorry. I would like to be able to answer your question, and maybe we could have an exchange afterwards.
Okay.
But I'm not following the question.
The question is this. The cutting edge agency on clean air that you as a state agency follow and everybody looked to, we had the proof that tailpipe emissions were misleading and did not reflect reality. And we abandoned that, I think, in 1992. In fact, I think even before that. When California recognized the failure of using tailpipe emissions, why in the world has EPA continued to use that system, which is faulty science? And you talk about science, faulty testing. Why haven't you gone to barn testing and total emissions, so it's a real world issue, not just sticking a probe in the tailpipe, but looking at total emissions?
Well, let me just make clear, we do actually look at tailpipe emissions, and we do have almost complete alignment with California, who also looks at tailpipe emissions. If you're talking about evaporative emissions, we also address those in various ways, and we look at the fuel that's being used in the vehicle or the engine. So we do look at a variety of ways in which we can actually reduce pollution using our fuels.
The point being is that the federal government is still not using as their standard for auto emissions, total emissions. They're using tailpipe, right?
We are using a variety of emissions, primarily tailpipe, but we look at evaporative emissions
Okay.
as well.
Ma'am, I'll just tell you the reason why we abandoned it, because we saw in real life experience that our modeling did not reflect reality, and so we abandoned that long time ago. And I still think that the federal government is consciously or unconsciously hiding the fact that evaporative emissions are a much bigger issue than what anybody wants to admit to, and tailpipe emissions is a faulty science that hides true emissions. And so I just ask us, we take a look at that and have a dialogue about, when we talk about let's go science, let's go to real science.
But you do agree that we both look at tailpipe emissions.
But you continue to hide evaporative emissions by even using tailpipe emissions, in my opinion. We use barn testing out there. We use cold start So you reflect the fact that the catalytic converters don't operate initially, and hot soak, which then reflects the evaporative emissions. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. You know, if you look back at the past 40 years of the Clean Air Act and you combine that with the improved fuel economy standards over time for the cars that we drive, this is a real success story for our country and a great success story for American families. I mean, I remember being younger in the 1970s and going out in the morning and those smog-filled mornings. We don't have those as much anymore thanks to the Clean Air Act. And we've also made fantastic progress on the gas mileage for our cars. And we're on track now for cars in America to the standard to be 55 miles per gallon by 2025. But a lot of those vehicles are already on the road. That American technology is out there. Someone in my family bought one of the cars recently. It's over 50 miles per gallon, and he loves driving by the gas stations these days. There are additional policies that the Congress can adopt to address high gas prices over the long term. And I'm very disappointed in my Republican colleagues because they continue to turn a blind eye to good public policy. Their prescription, according to the two bills here, is 1, roll back fundamental health protections. 2, create new bureaucracy on top of existing agencies. And then they continue to guard the subsidies to the big oil companies. These are not the answers. There are a few things we should be doing. We could require oil companies to use the oil that's produced in the United States from public lands and offshore to meet the energy needs here at home, and stopping the oil companies from exporting oil from our public lands and waters to overseas markets. I mean, our domestic production's at an 8-year high, and now America's a net exporter. We export more product. We could repeal the $4 billion per year in federal subsidies that are currently given to the big oil companies and use that money instead to fund investments that will make us less dependent on oil. After all, the big 5 oil companies made $137 billion in profit last year. And then you ask the American taxpayer not just to pay one time at the pump, you ask them to pay again when they fill out their tax return. We could have tighter oversight and regulation of Wall Street speculators to prevent them from artificially driving up the price of gasoline. We could do even more to increase fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks so they get even more miles per gallon and consumers will save on their gasoline cost. Just the standards we have in place now, it's predicted that will save the average American family at the pump over $8,000 over time. So that's meaningful and that's doable. And the two bills that are proposed here they're simply not the answer. First, let's start with the Gasoline Regulations Act. It studies, blocks, and delays EPA air quality protections that haven't even been proposed. And I have a hard time understanding how blocking rules that aren't even on the books would do anything to help consumers at the pump. Ms. McCarthy, would blocking EPA from taking action on rules that haven't even been proposed help lower gasoline prices?
No.
And this proposal also includes an amendment previously offered by Mr. Latta on the House floor. It's a radical proposal to overturn 40 years of clean air policy by undermining the goal that air should be clean enough to breathe safely. Ms. McCarthy, will gutting the Clean Air Act help lower gasoline prices?
No.
The bills we're discussing today also would create new government bureaucracies. Chairman Whitfield's proposal would create a new interagency committee to conduct an impossible study based on data that doesn't exist. Mr. Gardner's bill would assign the Department of Energy the job of developing a new plan for drilling on federal lands when oil is released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But this isn't even the Department of Energy's area of expertise. Mr. Abbey, do you think that adding another layer bureaucracy to help the Interior Department's oil drilling leasing process will help lower gasoline prices?
I do not.
What about you, Mr. Smith? Do you think adding another Department of Energy, adding the Department of Energy to the leasing process for federal lands will help lower gasoline prices?
I agree with Mr. Abbey. I do not.
The bill would also apparently require the USDA, the Interior Department, and even the Department of Defense to follow DOE's drilling plan, even if the plan is inconsistent with those departments' missions authorizing statutes or regulations. Mr. Smith, can you explain how forcing the Defense Department to follow the Department of Energy's drilling plan, even if it compromises military training, is a sound solution to rising gasoline prices?
I can't really answer that question.
And Mr. Abbey, can you explain how forcing Secretary Salazar to do whatever Secretary Chu says would help to lower gasoline prices?
Gentlelady's time has
I
expired.
do not see where it would add value.
Well, thank you for for your testimony. These bills are not
This time I recognize
real
the
solutions
gentleman
to
from
rising
Texas,
gasoline prices.
Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair. I'd like to welcome the witnesses. Thank you for coming today and giving us your time and expertise. And Ms. McCarthy, I'd like to talk to you about EPA's Tier 3 gasoline rulemaking. Because as you can imagine, the good people of Texas 22...
Mr. Olson, excuse me. You want to let me go? All right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, sir. As you can imagine, the good people of Texas 22 want me to ask you a lot of questions about how this rulemaking is going to impact their jobs. Compliance with these new standards will require refineries to make very large capital investments, and the cost will be passed down to the consumers. America is feeling the pain at the pump, as you alluded to in your opening statement. Our economy can't handle skyrocketing energy prices, as the President promised in the video my colleague from Illinois showed earlier today. Now is not the time for unjustified new regulations that will raise the price of fuel even further. In a letter to Congress in February, you affirmed that your agency plans to propose gasoline sulfur changes only, a likely reduction of 10 parts per million in sulfur. I know that you know that the Tier 2 standards have already reduced sulfur from 300 parts per million down to the current standard of 30 parts per million, a 90% reduction. Will EPA propose to reduce the sulfur standard to 10 parts per million? You said you were considering it.
We haven't even yet proposed the rule. It has not gone through interagency review. I hesitate to tell you what we will actually propose at the time. I will tell you that we are very interested in ensuring that there is a national standard for the amount of sulfur in gasoline and that it be a cost-effective way of achieving reductions. And I don't think that there is enough information out yet for people to assume that there are going to be significant capital expenses associated with complying with the rule that we have yet to propose.
And that's what they're most scared about, is they have no idea where you're going to go with this proposal. Again, we've achieved a 90% reduction. That's something to be very proud of. Has your agency studied how the Tier 3 standards will impact gasoline prices?
We will be, we will obviously have to do that, and we'll have a public debate about that when the rule comes out. It will be accompanied by a complete economic analysis that will look at all prices associated with this rule that we can identify.
I look forward to you getting us information. I'd like to also, do you believe that, as my colleague from Maryland mentioned earlier today, that he thinks that your study will result that gasoline prices are somewhere in the cost of a gallon of 1 penny will be with the increase to Tier 3 standards? You think 1 penny is a number on the price per gallon of gasoline, something like that, as my colleague from Maryland said?
Right now, the policies that we are considering, and again, it's yet to be gone through the process and out in the public arena, is we estimate that the costs associated with this rule will have an impact of less than a penny on a gallon of gasoline.
Well, I'd love to see that statement when you get it out there, because the facts back home, the work in the industry, think that it'll increase their manufacturing costs by about 9 cents a gallon. So almost, 9 times what you're proposing, what you think may be the limit there. That's significant. Do you know of any refineries right now that can comply with the 10 parts per million standard?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you know any refineries right now, ma'am, that can comply with the proposed 10 parts per million standard?
What I do know is that under our rules and under our proposal, we will be giving substantial lead time associated with any rule change, as we always do. In the case of fuel standards, it's usually 4 years. And I believe that the standard that we are considering is certainly achievable with current technologies.
Well, I've been told that 17 refineries currently can achieve those standards. But do you have any idea how many refineries are going to have to install expensive retrofits to comply with the 10 parts per million sulfur?
We will be looking at that and providing that information, and we're working with the refinery industry now, and I would note that they're already looking at how they can comply with these standards, and they always seem to be able to use their innovation and know-how to achieve these standards much more efficiently and at lower cost than we anticipate.
And I've been told that 110 or more refineries are going to have those expensive retrofits, little allergies here. And finally, do you have an idea what the cost is going to be to the industry to get down to 10 parts per million?
I cannot, that certainly will come out in the regulatory impact analysis that we release with the rule.
And obviously this probably have a negative impact on consumers. What about their health? I mean, obviously we have no power. That's going to impact our jobs. We have no jobs. That's going to mean no people with health care, no people out, people are out there struggling. That's the health impact. I mean, so I submit to you, EPA needs to include these analyses in your proposal. Can't just be done in a box in a vacuum. You have to take into account what you're actually doing to our economy, because there are health impacts of these rules. And it looks like I've used my time. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's bills may win the prize for legislative false advertising. These bills will not reduce gasoline prices by a single penny. Instead, they will block pollution controls, increase health costs for Americans, diminish our energy security, and create pointless new government bureaucracies. There's no silver bullet for gas prices. But there are some critical steps we can take to reduce our vulnerability to swings in world oil markets and gas prices. This administration is taking those steps and getting results. The most effective thing we can do is use less oil. If your car is more efficient, increased gas prices will have less effect on you. And if all of our cars and trucks are more efficient, increased gas prices will have less effect on our whole economy. Recent data from the Energy Information Administration underscores this point. Costs per mile driven were about 23 cents in 1980. Last month, gas prices were higher than any previous February, but thanks to more efficient vehicles, the cost per mile driven were lower, only 16 to 17 cents per mile. Ms. McCarthy, what has EPA done and what are you working on that will protect American consumers from gasoline price spikes?
We have been working on and
Is your mic on?
Is it? Okay. We continue to work on fuel economy standards with NHTSA, and what we do is ensure that there are greenhouse gas reductions that are driving both reductions in the amount of oil that is demanded by this country, as well as providing significant cost savings and cleaner air for the American people.
Mm-hmm. Millions of Americans are already enjoying savings at the pump with new model year 2012 vehicles. As new cars become more efficient, the least efficient, oldest cars are gradually phased out, improving efficiency, saving money throughout the whole fleet. In addition to reducing demand, the Obama administration is also increasing domestic production. Mr. Abbey, please describe the administration's achievements in increasing domestic production.
Well, as Mr. Smith indicated in his opening remarks, the domestic oil and gas production has increased each year of the Obama administration and is the highest it's been in almost a decade. And I know that there's some criticism that most of that increase is on private lands and minerals, but that's not necessarily the case. Even though there was a dip last year relative to the amount of oil that was produced from public lands, in the first 3 years of the Obama administration, total federal oil production has increased by 13%. Over what was produced in the final 3 years of the Bush administration.
Increasing U.S. production does not lower gas prices. Every oil market economist tells us that. Years of experience here and in other countries proves it. For example, Canada is a net oil exporter, but still experiences the same gasoline price spikes we do. The real answer to gas prices is to reduce our dependence on oil, which means transitioning to alternatives. Here, too, the Obama administration is investing serious effort and making real progress. Mr. Smith, what is the Department of Energy doing to develop alternatives to oil?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. One observation, we pointed out the fact that, as Director Abbey just mentioned, that oil production here is at an 8-year high. If you look back,
what are you doing to develop alternatives? Are you doing things in the battery technologies, vehicle electrification, renewable electric power, and natural gas vehicles? Are those things you're working on?
Congressman, we're working on all of those things.
And so that will help us develop alternatives so we don't have to use that as much oil, isn't that right?
Yes, it will.
Ms. McCarthy, what has the combination of more efficient vehicles and more alternatives to oil done to reduce U.S. oil dependence?
It has significantly reduced oil independence by billions of barrels of oil each and every year.
And Mr. Smith, what has happened with oil imports as a result of these achievements?
Oil imports have declined every year of this administration.
Oil imports have fallen from 60% to 45%. Last year, the U.S. became a net exporter of refined products for the first time since 1949, according to the EIA. The Obama administration is doing exactly what is necessary to reduce dependence on oil, reduce our vulnerability to gasoline price spikes over the long term. But there's no quick fix. Anyone who tells us that we can drill or deregulate our way to $2.50 gasoline isn't telling us the truth. Finally, I'd like to note that the Tier 3 clean vehicle and fuel requirements are critically important to reducing unhealthy air pollution that's affecting millions of Americans. Ms. McCarthy, when will EPA propose these provisions?
We are actively working on these rules, and we hope to have them ready for interagency review shortly.
Well, I urge you to do it as soon as possible. Cleaning up vehicles and fuels is a highly cost-effective way to reduce air pollution and keep our children and families healthy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just want to follow up on what I heard is that the administration is responsible for the reduction in oil imports. That's interesting, considering that most economists state that the reduction of imports is due to a recession where people used less. And so I assume that the President is now claiming credit for the recession now. Is that an accurate statement, Mr. Smith? Yes or no?
What we will say
that was not it's a yes or no. Is he claiming credit for the recession now, since that had the largest impact in reducing imports?
Congressman, that's not a yes or no question.
Well, then probably you shouldn't have answered that way. Now, Ms. McCarthy, are the new Tier 3 standards to be proposed, are those discretionary or mandatory?
We have not yet proposed the Tier 3 rules.
That's why I said to be proposed.
But they are
Are those discretionary or mandatory?
They are mandatory.
They are mandatory.
Yeah, we are required to look periodically at fuels and vehicles and to make adjustments to comply with the requirements.
Okay. Under what authority then specifically are they mandated?
I will get back to you with that, Mr. Congressman.
Do you know how much time you would need to be able to get back to us on the basis of the authority that they would be mandated? All right. Could you do it in 30 days?
I should clarify, and I just received clarification. When
They
I
are
said they were
discretionary.
mandatory, that we are looking at requirements to reduce pollution necessary to achieve ozone standards. They are not required, apparently, under Title II of the Act. They are a discretionary act on our part, which is providing cost-effective reductions of ozone precursors.
Okay, so they're discretionary.
I believe, if you're talking about whether or not this specific act is required under the Clean Air Act, no.
Good. Has EPA performed an analysis of the cumulative impacts of regulations on fuel prices?
When we look at every fuel rule, we look at the rules that have come before. They're built into the baseline, and we take those into account relative to our economic analysis.
So they have not yet been performed?
When we do a fuels analysis, we look, the baseline includes all of the regulations that have come before. So they take account of all of the regulations.
The studies that have been
when
done
we propose
before.
them.
On the cumulative impacts of the regulations, I think you're kind of half answering the questions, and so it's confusing me.
Well, you've defined cumulative impact differently in the proposed act that I'm testifying on, so I'm trying to make that distinction. When we do our rules, we look in the baseline. When we look at what the costs are associated with our rules, we consider all the rules that came before.
If I asked to be delivered within the next 24 hours, your analysis of the cumulative impacts to date on fuel prices, could you provide me anything?
Oh, we could provide you with an assessment of the individual, the costs associated with each of these rules.
So you said individual, but I'm talking about cumulative, where you can determine.
Well, some of those will be redundant. So there will be overlaps in those costs, but we can certainly provide you, as best we can, the information that you're looking for.
All right, and I asked about the cumulative impact on fuel prices. How about the cumulative effect of these regulations on businesses?
We look at impacts both relative to small businesses as well as the economy at large. We look at costs associated with refineries. We look at consumer costs. Those are all included in our economic analysis.
All right. But that's on an individual rule basis, but I'm talking about the cumulative nature of those. Has there been a study of how together they all affect businesses?
I don't think we could answer a question as broad as that with the analysis that we do.
All right, well, I think that answers the question, and it'd be no. Just one last observation in my 12 seconds, not a question, but we've heard along the rant earlier from the gentlelady from Florida that data doesn't exist. I think that's probably why we're here, but you've also then stated that you have studies that show that the Tier 3 will only impact gas prices 1%. So I'm hearing that you don't have studies, but that you do have studies. So yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today is the 17th time this committee has met to discuss some form of repeal of the EPA's Clean Air Act authority during this Congress, and the House has acted so far on Republican bills to, one, prevent EPA from reducing the amount of oil we have to import from hostile nations, two, preventing EPA from reducing the toxic mercury, dioxin, and other chemicals that spew out of power plants and other industrial sources, three, prevent EPA from reducing harmful global warming pollution, four, Republicans have even felt compelled to prevent EPA from promulgating fictitious regulations to reduce levels of farm, fairy, or pixie dust. And why did the Republican majority do that? Because when unemployment is spiking, Republicans tell us EPA regulations, even the non-existent ones, are going to kill jobs. But that storyline is getting harder and harder to sell as the economy improves and improves and improves month after month after month, and we see positive job numbers. So what are the Republicans doing to try to convince Americans anew of the reason why EPA must be stopped now? Well, they shake up the Etch-a-Sketch and tell Americans that the new reason to limit and postpone EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act is to stop gas prices from spiking. And just like the committee's earlier efforts to repeal non-existent regulations to reduce levels of farm or fairy dust, this new bill also requires a trip to fantasy land. Ms. McCarthy, isn't it true that the EPA has no plans to propose an expensive standard to lower the Reid vapor pressure in gasoline, and that what you will propose is likely to cost only 1 penny per gallon?
That's correct.
Isn't it true that there are also no rules currently in development to reduce global warming pollution from refineries.
That is correct.
And just so I'm clear, are any of the rules that this bill delays or weakens the reason why gas prices are so high?
No.
So when Americans pull up to the pump these days, there's no question that it's stressful. They see their paychecks trickling away right in front of them, and they can't understand why these prices are spiking. But let me just say this to all the members if they want to hear it. This is not about Obama. This is about OPEC, oil companies, and Wall Street speculators. Now, what does the majority want to do about those things? One, should we deploy the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to send a signal to Wall Street speculators? Republican answer, no, absolutely not. That would interfere with the free market that OPEC totally manipulates in their meetings in Vienna. Number two, should we fully fund the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the police on the beat for Wall Street speculation? The Republicans say, no, we're going to kneecap that agency, keep the cops off the beat, and try to stop the rulemakings on manipulation, on position limits, on the kinds of power that the agency would need. Three, the Democrats say, keep the oil and gas that's drilled for on public lands in the United States. Don't send it overseas. How do the Republicans vote? No, send that oil overseas. Send that gas overseas. So, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to lowering gas prices, you know, when you say to them, hey, let's make sure the Keystone Pipeline oil stays in the United States, the Republicans say, oh no, we're voting no on that. And you did all vote no to keep the Keystone oil in the United States. We had that vote out in the House floor 3 weeks ago. So this crocodile tear concern about consumers and trying to blame the EPA when you have within your own power right now to do something about gasoline prices is so clear in terms of what the goal is. It's not about Obama, it's about OPEC, oil companies, Wall Street manipulators, and speculators, and we see no activity on the side of the Republicans in taking any actions in this area. Moreover, just for the record, there are 1/3 more rigs, floating rigs, that are going to be in the Gulf of Mexico this summer than there were before the oil spill. So this is a very bad way that Obama has of having a plot to undermine oil drilling in our country if 1/3 more floating rigs are going to be in the Gulf of Mexico this summer than there were before the actual BP historical worst environmental spill in the United States. And by the way, each one of those CEOs should be sitting down here. You want to investigate the mess we've got in the country? BP should be sitting next to Halliburton, and we should have them under oath, and they should be explaining why they lied or were incompetent in saying only 1,000 barrels per day were going into the Gulf of Mexico. I thank the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And to Mr. Abbey, a question for you. Oil production on federal lands increased in 2009 and 2010 as a result of leasing and permitting decisions made before your administration took office. However, the fall-off in leasing and permitting actions under the Obama administration is apparent, and even your own EIA anticipates continued fall-off in production in 2012 and beyond. Isn't it true that BLM leased fewer onshore acres than any administration going all the way back to 1984?
There's a lot of factors that come into play where we lease. I will say this, that we are moving forward aggressively in identifying appropriate areas for leasing, and we're making progress in offering up more acres each year.
So just let me repeat the question. Is it true that BLM leased fewer onshore acres than any administration going all the way back to 1984?
A lot of that's based upon the market. For example,
is it yes or no? We know that I have the public land statistics right here. So is it yes or no? Have you leased?
We offered up 4.4 million acres for lease last year.
Onshore acreage, according to this, shows the past 3 years, 2009, 2010, 2011, the lowest on record going back to 1984. And it's public land statistics is what I'm citing, data for FY 1984 through FY 2011 from your website. So is that true?
That is true.
So yes, lowest number since 1984. Thank you. Oil and gas production on federal lands and waters declined 14% in 2011. However, oil and gas production experienced a massive increase last year on lands controlled by state and private entities. The CRS last week, Congressional Research Service, reported that 96% of the increase in oil and gas production between 2007 and 2011 has occurred on non-federal lands, the lands you do not have anything to do with. Since the federal government does not manage private lands, do you think it's fair for it to take credit for private market decisions?
Congressman, total natural gas production from public lands, and I'm talking about onshore, has increased 6% during the first 3 years of the Obama administration, then during the last 3 years of the Bush administration.
So are you taking credit for private land production as well?
I'm talking about public lands.
But
6%
I'm asking a
on
question
public
about
lands.
private land. You said natural gas, correct? Not oil?
Natural gas. On
But not oil.
On oil, it's
It
increased
decreased last year.
13% over the last 3 years, or the first 3 years of the Obama
And what about
administration.
last year?
Last year it took a dip.
It did take a dip.
Yes.
Thank you. Further question for you, Mr. Abbey. Citigroup last week predicted total liquids production could double for the continent in the next decade, and that the United States could overtake both Russia and Saudi Arabia in oil production by 2020. Here's what Citi said about new energy production would mean for the U.S. Real GDP would increase by 2 to 3.3%. That's $370 to $624 billion. 3.6 million direct and indirect jobs could be created by 2020 as a consequence of increased energy production. Our trade deficit could shrink by 80 to 90%. The value of the dollar could jump by 1.6 to 5.4% due to increased energy production. And risks to the United States, in particular, geopolitical risks, would dramatically decrease. But the only caveat in this report, here's the Citi report right here, is this, and this is a quote from the report. Whether the increase in production results in the U.S. reducing its imports or whether net exports grow doesn't matter much to world balances. Either way, North America is becoming the new Middle East. The only thing that can stop this is politics, environmentalists getting the upper hand over supply in the U.S., for instance. Yet, according to CRS, as I mentioned, 96% of the increase in production from 2007 to 2011 was on non-federal lands. Only about 5.5% of government lands onshore are leased for energy, and you've said the lowest amount in 3 years, since 1984, the past 3 years leased. And 93% of the shale oil and gas wells have occurred on non-federal lands. And there is no commercial leasing system for government lands for oil shale production, even though Congress ordered one in 2005. And people are worried, including Indian tribes, about new regulations regarding drilling and fracking that might affect their energy production. Assuming you agree that more jobs, more GDP growth, more oil production, and more potential to become the largest producer of energy in the world are good things, how do you square your administration of lands and these sorry statistics with those goals? It's clearly not working.
Well, what I did not see in that report is the fact that there's 50 million acres that have already been leased by the Department of Interior that are going undeveloped at this point in time.
Does a lease guarantee production?
It does not.
Does an oil rig guarantee production?
It does not.
Thank you. Further questions to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, last week Secretary Chu testified saying that supply mattered when it came to price, and I'll quote him, if long-term decreased demand has an effect on price, then don't the basic laws of supply and demand dictate that so will long-term increased supplies? His response, I absolutely agree. Do you believe increased supply will decrease cost?
What we do believe is that over the long term, increased supply will have an impact on global oil
So
prices.
a long-term increase in supply will decrease cost like the Strategic Energy Production Act calls for?
I would disagree with the premise of that statement, given that this act, what it will do is simply tie an activity that's going on anyway, which is trying to make sure that we're prudently developing acres on public land, with an important operational capability that the federal government has. So I would disagree with your assertion that this act would actually have an impact on U.S. production or on global oil prices.
So if you have this, under this act, 3% of federal lands is leased onshore. Without this act.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
Without this act, 3% of federal lands is leased. Without this act.
Without this act?
Yeah, as it stands today, 3% of federal lands is leased.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing the question. 3% of federal lands is what?
Leased.
Is leased. 3%
Correct.
of federal, well, I mean, you'd have to direct that question, I think, to be a little bit.
My time's expired. Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I noted with some interest earlier when Mr. Shimkus was talking that he made several comments that I happen to agree with, and then Mr. Rush said, well, this is much ado about nothing. Much ado about nothing I have to beg to differ. 3 companies in my region have recently either laid off employees or idled production of coal. Much ado about nothing? Tell that to those employees. When you take utility MAC, boiler MAC, transfer rule, and coal ash, and now the greenhouse gas regulations on utilities, you're affecting jobs. My district has a median household income of $36,000. Median household income. The president said that they were going to raise electric rates. Now, he was talking about his cap and trade scheme at the time. But Ms. McCarthy, this is going to raise electricity rates because, as the president said when he was campaigning, the utilities, and his quote was, they will pass that money on to consumers. Isn't that true with your utility plan as well?
We looked at the impact of the mercury and air toxic standard on electricity rates, and we did not see a significant increase as a result of that rule, and that was based on looking at the cross-state air pollution rule as well. The greenhouse gas standard that we announced yesterday has nothing to do with the electricity rates.
Has nothing to do with electricity rates because it doesn't affect the current facilities. Isn't that correct?
And it also has very little impact on the future facilities that we anticipate to be constructed.
They would be constructed not using coal, however.
They have a place should natural gas rise so much in price that coal would again become competitive. Right now, in most places, it is not.
All right. If we could see that clip, please. We can't hear it again. All right, well, let me just read it.
Because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted. That will also generate billions of dollars that we can invest in solar, wind, biodiesel, and other alternative energy approaches.
All right.
The only thing that
let me read you what else was in there. When I was asked earlier about the issue of coal, you know, under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Those are well, let me finish the quote and then I'll get on to my hypothesis. Even regardless of what I say about whether coal is good or bad, because I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal power plants, you know, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that on to the consumers. Now, I have to ask you, Ms. McCarthy, when the president has a little more flexibility, when he gets past November, do you anticipate that that flexibility will incorporate not only the existing, not only the future power plants, but existing coal power plants, and that new regulations will come forward on the existing plants at that time?
The regulations we announced are a common sense step forward that look at regulating solely greenhouse gas emissions from future power plants. That is what's in the works. That's what we're taking comment on. It is not a cap. It is an emission rate that relies on modern technology and that can be delivered today.
But when the president has more flexibility, if we believe his words, and we believe his words from his last campaign, don't you anticipate that he's going to make the cost rise on the use of coal and even natural gas, because they're both carbon-based fuels? Wouldn't you anticipate that? If you were sitting in my shoes watching your district being decimated in jobs across the board, because the electricity rates don't just affect the coal mines and the coal miners and the people relying on coal, they affect every business in my district, because in our area we're reliant on coal at this time to produce every good that we produce.
Right now, the flexibility that the president is allowing allowing EPA to provide the public health benefits that the legislature asked us to deliver relative to the Clean Air Act. That's the kind of flexibility that I expect him to continue to provide.
And so when it comes to using of the carbon-based fuels, you expect less flexibility so that he can be more flexible in cleaning up the air and taking away the jobs of the hardworking American taxpayer. Is that correct?
The President was very clear that it's an all of the above strategy. The rule we proposed
All of the
yesterday,
above, but doesn't include coal. That's a four-letter word now, isn't it?
it allows a pathway forward for coal as well as natural gas.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes a gentleman with a birthday today from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
You would add that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Ms. McCarthy. That last question perhaps needed a little bit more, but if we have time, we'll get back to that. But it's interesting that you said all of the above.
Yes.
And you said, I think earlier in your testimony about the for sequestration with coal, they can go ahead with sequestration. But I thought, maybe I didn't hear correctly. Did you say there is an existing facility now with sequestration? You said it's going on today.
There are facilities that are large-scale
Can you share with that? We don't have any. I have no listing of those commercial. Could you send that to our office or someone to release that?
I most certainly will.
If you would, thank you. But let's go back to the sequestration again, because in your testimony, you're saying you believe in we should be pursuing the sequestration as a route to continue to use fossil fuels, coal particularly.
I think the administration.
But yet the DOE just cut the NETL's laboratory by 41%. So that's where the research and development for coal. That's where we have the plans for carbon capture and sequestration, which didn't get funded at all under this. So can you share, do you agree with the DOE's idea to slash funding for coal research?
I am aware that there's been significant funding to
my question was, do you agree with it?
I am not aware of DOE's current plan.
You weren't aware that they cut it 41%?
NETL.
I'm astounded with that because I think the idea of using it is fine, but then to cut the research for it shows it's disingenuous on the part of this administration to have it, but try to have it both ways. Let me go to the economic models, because in your testimony on page 2 of 10, you use a lot of statistics. You talk about the model year 2016, the cars will cost maybe only $950, but we have heard from testimony from the EPA time and time again that it just, I really have to question your economic model. If you look at, if we could have up on the chart, first one, you were predicting, or the EPA was predicting that the grid reliability was only going to be 4 gigawatts, and everyone else was showing that they were in the 50 to 60 to 70 gigawatts of potential loss. We already have one company, First Energy alone, cut 4 gigawatts out of the system. So there's your model. There's what you're saying, and I've got to question it. Let me go to the second one having to do with heavy-duty trucks. In this chart, this is from 2004 to 2010. The compliance, you can see it in different years. That it talks about in these charts. This one in particular says in 2004, the EPA was predicting that the cost of compliance was only going to be $900 and some dollars, or less than $1,000, but in reality, it was over $4,000. And in 2007, you were predicting it might be $4,000, but in reality, it was closer to $8,000. And then just 2 years ago, you all were predicting it was going to be just over $3,000, but the cost was $9,000. Could I see the next chart? Here's another one in 2010. This talks about your estimate was $3,400. But look down the list of all of these from Freightliner, International, Kenworth, Mack, Peterbilt, Volvo, Western Star are all in the $9,000 range, 3 times the amount that you all were predicting. I really question your ability to estimate, and because we rely on those estimates when the people on the other side of the aisle, we're trying to work together on this, and if your numbers are good, we want to work with them. But I come from the construction industry. when we give an estimate, we live with it. Are you ready to live with it? If your estimates are wrong, are you going to reimburse the consumers for the cost that you have incurred because you have convinced Congress to adopt these heavy regulations because they're only going to cost $3,000, but in the real world it costs $9,000. Are you going to reimburse the consumers?
I believe that over the course of the last 40 years that EPA has done some of the best economic modeling available to any agency.
So you're disagreeing with all your...
I do not have any idea what those charts were, who they developed them, or on what basis. Those were not charts developed by the EPA. So if that information is available, we're happy to take a look at it and to provide you some input as to whether or not we believe it's accurate.
That's fair. I mean, I've got your numbers. You just projected your numbers at $900, and we can see it's going to, and you're predicting it's going to be $900 4 years from now.
And the only other thing I would like to clarify is that the retirement slide that you put up is we took great pains in the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard to do that, understanding the impacts associated with the utility industry. We knew that there were more than those retirements, strictly as a matter of business decisions related to the market. What you are seeing closing are inefficient, old coal-fired power plants that cannot compete moving forward. I do not believe
the gentleman's time has expired.
To the Mercury and Air
I'm sorry, my time's elapsed, but everyone else had the same information and they used more accurate. They came to a better conclusion than you did. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Pompeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to try and I think these pieces of legislation are both good. I think there's a few things that changed, but I think they make good sense. I want to make sure and get a couple facts straight, Ms. McCarthy, about what you said in your testimony today, and then I want to talk about your theory of regulation. So you said nothing in these regulations has any impact on high gasoline prices. Is that correct?
We were speaking about the current gasoline prices. That is absolutely true.
Do you believe that both for the short term and the long term? That is, do these regulations have you? So I've heard some trying to say, well, it can't do anything about tomorrow's gasoline prices. Do you think this impacts next week's or next year's or a decade's from now's gasoline prices?
All I can tell you is that we have managed a number of fuel and vehicle programs over the years, and as far as we know, the result of the impacts of those relative to gasoline prices is dwarfed by crude oil prices, by taxes, by other inputs that go into the price of gasoline.
Yeah, I disagree. Do you think the same thing for electricity? So we talked about gasoline. Do you think these regulations have no impact on electricity prices in America? Because we've been talking about gas, now electricity.
Well, the regulations in
I'm asking you about electricity. Do you think these regulations...
Are we talking about
I'm talking about the cumulative set of regulations that EPA has pending and current. Do you think they impact, you've testified before, do you think they impact electricity prices?
I'm trying to see how.
Okay, so you think they don't? No impact.
I don't believe so.
Yeah, the more the merrier. I want to talk about your theory of regulation you mentioned. You said, hey, we're gonna essentially put these new rules on new coal-fired power plants, but that's okay because no one's building them anyway.
That isn't my theory. That's an analysis by the Energy Information Office and EIA, and they are the ones that have done modeling that took a look at what power plants are being constructed, and it's really on the basis of market conditions. What's competitive?
Right. So your justification for this set of this greenhouse gas rule that you presented yesterday is that it's okay because no one's building them anyway.
No, that was how we analyzed the result of the costs and benefits. The reason for regulating greenhouse gases from power plants is because greenhouse gases pose a danger to public health and welfare, and they are a regulated pollutant, and as a regulated pollutant under the Clean Air Act, we must move forward with new source performance standards. That's why we did the rule.
So why do you talk about that? Why do you talk about what the market might or might do in response? You just throw it out there as a justification to explain to the American people?
It's part of the economic analysis that you're interested in us pursuing was to look at what are the costs and benefits as a result of the rule. Right. We are required to regulate greenhouse gases. We've tried to do that in a reasonable reasonable way. We've identified costs. What is clear is that because of the availability of natural gas and the low cost, that coal is not competitive at this moment, so it's not anticipated that these rules would have a significant cost impact. That's what we have identified.
I appreciate that. You say coal's not competitive. I will tell you, compared to solar, compared to wind, compared to all the things that you're taking taxpayer money to throw resources at, I will promise you that coal is intensely competitive. It's why we're using it in America today. It's because consumers care about their rates. You haven't talked about ratepayers one moment today. You haven't talked to the fact that ratepayers all across America may or may not know it, but they are thrilled that we are using coal-fired power plant generation in America today because it allows them to continue to take care of their families and heat their homes and cool their homes and all the things that consumers care about. Manufacturers care about it too. They need to make sure they have affordable electricity as well. As you continue to foreclose these paths, and I've heard others listed, I have, depending on how you count them, 13 to 15 different sets of rules and regulations just in my time in Congress that you all have imposed on the fossil fuel industry. And to sit here today and tell me this isn't going to impact costs for consumers and costs for our businesses and jobs in America, I just think it's Alice in Wonderland, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time, appreciate the panel coming today. I think it's important that we continue to talk about energy policy in this country and different proposals that we brought forward in the House and passed in the House that actually would increase energy production, implement a real all-of-the-above strategy, and lower gas prices at the pump. It's unfortunate that the Senate has blocked that legislation. It's unfortunate the President continues to oppose that. And it gets into my questions. And Mr. Abbey, in your opening statement, you made a number of comments I want to go through, but you said, quote, "This is why the President and the Department has continued to promote and implement an all-of-the-above approach to American energy." And I know the President said that out on the campaign trail a lot. He's, taken the language that we've been using. We've actually filed an all-of-the-above bill, passed all-of-the-above legislation, and now the prices are going higher. The President is feeling the heat from his policies, and so he's trying to say that he's for all of the above. And unfortunately, if you look at the record, it just doesn't back up that the President or your agency supports an all-of-the-above strategy. I want to start with the permatorium in the Gulf of Mexico. In my area, we've seen since not only the moratorium, but even after the moratorium was lifted, there's still what people consider a permatorium in the Gulf of Mexico. It's very difficult to have any kind of consistent policy out of Department of Interior that allows people to go back to work. We've seen about a dozen deep-water rigs leave not only the Gulf of Mexico, but leave the United States. Left this country, taking about 12,000 jobs with it. That number is now up to about 19,000 jobs. And I'm not sure if you've seen this. I hope you would go look if you haven't. A group called Greater New Orleans, Inc., which is an alliance of business organizations in the New Orleans region, did a study called The Impact of Decreased and Delayed Drilling Permit Approvals on Gulf of Mexico Businesses. And I'm not sure if you've seen it. I'd like to submit this for the record, if I can ask unanimous consent, to have this report issued.
Without objection.
Because they actually surveyed not the big 5 oil companies, small businesses that are American businesses that service the oil and gas industry. And what they found in their report, 41% of those businesses are not making a profit. In fact, 50% of the businesses, and you can see this in the report, 50% of the businesses in the oil and gas industry have laid off workers as a result of your policies. And so while you're out there touting and saying, hey, production's up, everything's great, the companies that actually do this with over $100 a barrel oil, with gasoline skyrocketing, they're laying people off in the industry because they can't go to work. They've sent rigs to places like Egypt. And so people have calculated that it's better to do business in Egypt than in the United States because of your policies. And so when you're making those statements, that's not an all-of-the-above policy. When companies are losing money or laying people off in America because they've got to send jobs overseas. And so I would hope you would take a look at that. Have you seen that report yet?
I have not, but what I have seen are statistics that would lead me to believe that the pace of permitting is at nearly pre-Macondo levels as it stands today.
Okay, and I know you've talked about that too, and I've got some information that unfortunately disputes what you just said there and what your testimony said, because again, in your testimony, you tout here that you've had increased total federal oil production has increased by 13% during the first 3 years of the Obama administration combined, yet your own Department of Energy, your own administration's agency, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, confirms that production in the Gulf of Mexico was down 22% in 2011, projected to be down 30% in 2012. Again, Energy Information Administration said in the Rockies, leasing is down 68% since President Obama took office. This is federal lands. And all of this is down. That's not an all-of-the-above strategy. And again, I don't know, do you dispute those numbers? Because they're actually looking at your data. I mean, Energy Information Administration is under the Obama administration, and they're using real numbers, and they're saying that production is actually down 22% last year. Do you dispute that?
Congressman.
I know I'm running out of time. A yes or no? I mean, yes or no? Do you dispute it, or do you know about
the
it?
statistics speak for themselves, but the
well, they do, and they say that it's down. It says it's not all of the above. That's not all of the above. When you've got production down because of your policies, when we're losing jobs because of your policies, I want to ask Ms. McCarthy. We've seen some numbers from a number of different entities. And you talk about this as well, but we see on EPA going after hydraulic fracturing, and this is something that's been one of the few areas that's actually been doing well. President Obama, touts the success of hydraulic fracturing, and we do. Unfortunately, the president hasn't been able to shut it down. It's mostly on private lands. But now we're seeing that we understand next week EPA plans to issue a new source performance standard on hydraulic fracturing, which will actually decrease one of the big areas that's actually been doing well in this industry. And that's not all of the above. Are y'all getting ready to release some kind of new source performance standards on hydraulic fracturing?
We are under a deadline to release that next week, yes, but it's not a rules that's specifically focused on hydraulic fracking.
Right.
It's a
and that's
rule
been one of the few areas that's been up.
From oil and gas.
And so now y'all are going to go after that too. So the president's actually shut down areas in leasing. He rejected Keystone XL pipeline.
What the rule is, and we'll show you that it's not just cost effective, but it will be a way to actually enhance development.
And people have heard that before, and then they see their prices go up even higher when y'all go in and try to help enhance production. It usually means people are going to pay higher prices for energy, and people are fed up with those higher prices.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I hope y'all would review those policies again. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the witnesses for the first panel, and your time is done. So thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate your willingness to testify. And if the second panel witnesses would please come take the table.
Yeah, he's leaving.
We have testifying on this panel and then go through this week. He's missing the two names of the two.
want to welcome the panel today for joining us and for your testimony and time today. Appreciate your willingness to be here and the expertise that you're going to provide. We'll begin this testimony to my left here, Mr. Burkhart, Managing Director, Global Oil Group, IHS Cambridge Energy Research Associates. You'll be given 5 minutes to testify, and thank you for joining us. And also joined on the panel today by Matthew, let's see, where is it at in order here? By Dr. Joseph Rahm, a Senior Fellow, Center for American Progress. Jack Coleman, Mr. Jack Coleman, Managing Partner and General Counsel, Energy North America. Mr. Matt Smorch, Vice President of Strategic Planning, CountryMark. Mr. Robert Myers, Senior Counsel, Crowell and Mooring. Mr. Niger Innes, Co-Chairman, Affordable Power Alliance, and Dr. George Schenck, Managing Director and Principal, Navigant Economics, here on behalf of the Emissions Control Technology Association. Thank you very much for joining us. Each panelist will be given 5 minutes. Mr. Burkhart, you may begin.
Thank you very much.
Press your microphone. Thank you.
Is that on? Okay, good. Thank you very much for the opportunity, a very timely opportunity to discuss oil and gasoline markets and the role of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. As we all know, gasoline is nearing $4 per gallon on average in the United States, which isn't far from the all-time high of $4.17 in 2008. And this is clearly a burden for American motorists and businesses. Since the beginning of the year, gasoline is up nearly 20%, and the reason for that is mainly due to higher crude oil prices. So what's driving crude oil prices? The main driver is geopolitics, specifically concern over the adequacy and reliability of oil supplies due to the uncertainty surrounding the
microphone turn off. Mr. Burkhart, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I think your microphone may have been bumped and turned off again. Thank you. Pull it up a little bit closer to you. Is the light on? Okay, thank you. Continue.
Well, we'll just go ahead. Okay. So in November last year, the International Energy Atomic Agency, that's not working on this, stated that Iran has carried out activities relevant to the development of the nuclear explosive device. And in the time since that report was issued, the U.S. and the European Union have adopted sanctions aimed at hindering Iran's economy, particularly by making it more difficult for Iran to sell its oil.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt. Dr. Rahm, 5 minutes, please. Just ask you to speak very loudly, please. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rahm. And Mr. Coleman, for 5 minutes, please. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. And Mr. Smorch, recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Smorch, for your testimony, and I'm going to recess the committee for such time as may be necessary to put this new microphone up and hope we can get it addressed quickly. Don't blink, don't. Good Lord. Try your mic. I think we may have fixed it.
Testing.
Mic check. Testing 1, 2, 3. Sounds like it works. Oh, you better try it.
Testing. I guess that works.
Yeah.
Good. We're fairly sure we fixed the problem.
Okay. Great.
Well, thank you. We'll go ahead and reconvene committee. And Mr. Myers, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. First, just want to thank Chairman and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to be here and ask a full written statement be put place into the record. My written testimony addresses the cumulative impact analysis required by the discussion draft, pending Cleaner Act rulemakings affecting the refinery sector, and the projected timing for the new requirements. And I also address the parts of legislation that affect the promulgation of ozone standards. What my bottom line conclusion is that it makes sense to do a comprehensive analysis, and it also makes sense to do it at this time. A fundamental issue in this legislation, as my experience tells me for a while, is that anytime you're dealing with a Cleaner Act, you always have to face the challenge of why do we want to change anything. And I can completely understand why EPA is taking the position that they do. They're charged with implementing the Act. That's their role. But I wanted to clarify a couple things from the first panel. First, from my reading of the discussion draft, there's no rollback under the bill. It doesn't affect current regulations. So my definition of rollback would be, if you're affecting current regulations. By definition, you're looking at the effect of regulations in the future. Second, I was also a little bit confused in terms of we're to understand that in terms of the Tier 3 rulemaking, it's not been decided exactly what the regulations are, but at the same time, we know they cost less than a penny. The two don't go together because cost analysis is essentially derivative of what the regulatory standards are. So my questions there go with respect to the current, if you look on the current OMB iteration of the rulemaking, we're also dealing not only with residual authority in the Act to set standards, but 211V regarding renewable fuel standards and 211H, which deal with volatility. Now, they may not do volatility through other authority in the Act, but you also have the issue with the E15 waiver at this point in time, whether the current 1 pound waiver exists. And that could be another significant cost impact if, based on decision to allow E15, if you don't allow a 1 pound waiver, you will have an effect of effectively decreasing the volatility of ethanol blended gasolines by those two actions. In any event, in terms of the general nature of the bill, in terms of looking at multi-pollutant strategies, this is something that the agency itself has talked about and advocated. Indeed, just last fall, the Cleaner Act Advisory Committee concluded that the time was right to take a more vigorous look at opportunities to align and optimize across the various Clean Air Act regulations affecting individual sectors. That's an outside committee that advises EPA. My written testimony outlines the nexus between the various rulemakings contained in the discussion draft, but I was trying to think of a simple analogy, and I think of it mostly as taxes. As an individual, we need to pay multiple tax levies, sales taxes, school taxes, property taxes, federal, state, sometimes local, and federal and gas and state taxes. And I'm certain that each of these taxes were initially enacted to convey a public benefit. But it's really their combined effect on individuals and our economy that we feel, not the individual levies themselves, although sometimes they can be painful. So I don't see the intellectual leap it takes to support a comprehensive review of the cumulative impact of regulations. The bill does not require the government to do the impossible, but instead allows reliance on available data. Despite the numerous executive orders, the plain fact of the matter is that such reviews aren't done. I'll give you a few examples. In the latest transport rule, EPA did not examine the effects of the current program, even though it's being implemented in over 24 states. EPA's climate rules didn't examine the impact of the rule on stationary sources, even though the net effect of the rules, and as was explained in the earlier panel, as a result of these determinations, now you need to have greenhouse gas permitting for large facilities. And EPA doesn't consider NAAQS to impose costs on small businesses, state, local, or tribal governments, or the private sector. Why? Because the prevailing view is that NAAQS do not directly impose regulations on sources. This is legally correct, but analytically it's problematic. So the basic question is, why does this system of analysis make more sense than targeted legislation to require an assessment of the cumulative costs of regulating the petroleum sector? What is essentially so sacrosanct about the current way we consider costs and benefits? My written testimony tries to point this out in detail, but basically, in terms of the impact going forward, I made a couple observations. One, with regard to Tier 3, you're talking models 2017 cars and vehicles, other light-duty vehicles. So you're talking essentially approximately about 5 years from now before the effective date of standards. In a similar fashion, I understand EPA's current ozone regulations to require plans for regulations to require rules about 28 months from now. Under the reading of the bill, you've got 13 months for the study. So it would seem to be that you do have enough time, well enough time, to do a comprehensive study before the impact of the regulations are going to be felt. So I'll sum up here by just saying that the last thing I think you should look at was March 20th memo from Cass Sunstein, head of the OIRA, the OMB office, where he directed agencies to take active steps to take into account the cumulative effects of new and existing rules and to identify opportunities to harmonize and streamline multiple rules. The discussion draft in large part implements this directive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Mr. Ennis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority Member Rush, members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. I also want to thank your crack technical team for getting our mics up and running. I'm here in my capacity as co-chairman of the Affordable Power Alliance and national spokesman for the Congress of Racial Equality, one of our nation's oldest civil rights organizations. In 2007, CORE's national chairman, Roy Ennis, wrote the book, Energy Keepers, Energy Killers, The New Civil Rights Battle. The premise of my chairman's book is that the final frontier of the civil rights revolution is the fight for economic opportunity, and that access to reliable, affordable sources of energy is integral to providing that economic opportunity. Conversely, when energy prices are raised due to the market or unfortunate government policy, that final frontier becomes all the more difficult to reach. And that makes high energy prices, be it gasoline for our cars or electricity for our homes, an assault on the people's ability to exercise their fundamental civil rights. The book Energy Keepers, Energy Killers inspired the formation of the Affordable Power Alliance. This alliance is led by the Congress of Racial Equality and was joined by the High Impact Leadership Coalition of Churches, the 60 Plus Association, the 2-decade-old Senior Citizens Advocacy Group, and the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, which is the largest Hispanic Christian organization in the country with a network of over 30,000 member churches. The Affordable Power Alliance campaign has promoted the message that affordable energy is a critical element of today's civil rights struggle, because energy is the master resource that reaches into every facet of our lives. We cannot tolerate bureaucratic bans and regulations that separate people from that desperately needed affordable energy. Affordable energy is not only a vital resource, it is a moral imperative. Rising energy prices disproportionately discriminate against the poorest and most disadvantaged among us. People don't want energy welfare. They want affordable energy. They want affordable prices based on abundant supply, not government subsidies, and certainly not artificially high prices based on bureaucratic bans and regulations. EPA's current automotive standards, enacted in 2000 and implemented beginning in 2004, already require vehicles to be 77 to 95% cleaner and reduce the sulfur content of gasoline by up to 90%. As for fuel efficiency, fuel economy, which has been discussed a great deal today, these standards, the EPA admits already, they will raise automobile sticker prices by $1,000 by 2016 and $3,000 by 2025. Industry estimates are often higher. These higher sticker prices would disqualify nearly 7 million working-class Americans and potentially new car buyers. So you can't get the fuel savings if you can't afford the car in the first place. The legislation before this subcommittee, I believe, we, the Affordable Power Alliance and the Congress of Racial Equality believe, will help America produce affordable and reliable energy for all its citizens. Mr. Chairman, the Affordable Power Alliance and CORE are not here today with an economic plea. We are here to give our support to these measures as a moral imperative to remove the bans and regulations that now force energy prices beyond the means of millions of decent, worthy Americans. And I see that I have a little bit more time. Very quickly, we've made a tremendous amount of progress in our country. Minority Member Rush, Congressman Rush, was a part of that great civil rights revolution, along with my father and many others, that changed this country for the better. It would be tragic if the social and the political activity and progress that we've made as a country would be balanced off with a stifling of economic mobility, which has been the hallmark of making this country the greatest country on earth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Innes. And Dr. Schenck, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I want to thank you for allowing me to appear before you and testify regarding this very important and relevant topic. As an economist, my work over the past 30 years has been focused largely on the energy industry. Today, I'm here to discuss some economic issues related to EPA's Tier 3 motor vehicle emission and fuel standards. There are 4 major points I will make today regarding Tier 3 related to the effects not only on gas prices, but also on the environment, human health, and the economy. These points are addressed in more detail in my written testimony. First, it is vital to understand that Tier 3 has absolutely nothing to do with the recent increases in gasoline prices. The Tier 3 rules have not yet been proposed and will not go into effect until 2017. The retail price of gasoline depends on numerous demand and supply factors, with the global price of crude oil being the most important. The cents per gallon increases in U.S. retail prices and global crude oil prices over the last 3 years are virtually identical. That is, the entire increase in U.S. retail gasoline prices over the last 3 years can be fully explained by the increases in global oil prices. Second, the estimates of the marginal cost to U.S. refiners of meeting the Tier 3 standards prepared on behalf of the oil industry by Baker and O'Brien are significantly overstated. Initially, these marginal cost estimates were up to 25 cents per gallon and included the cost to U.S. refiners of reducing both the sulfur content and vapor pressure of gasoline. However, the EPA has stated that the Tier 3 rules will only involve reducing the sulfur content of gasoline. The oil industry's revised marginal cost estimates for U.S. refineries are 6 to 9 cents per gallon for just the sulfur reduction. The oil industry's estimated average increase in U.S. refining cost is only 2.1 cents per gallon. However, there are 2 major concerns with the assumptions underlying the oil industry's marginal and average cost estimates. First, the investment cost and resulting annual capital costs are unrealistically high. Second, the cost estimates are developed without taking into account the option of averaging and trading across refineries. The latter omission biases the marginal cost estimates upward dramatically. It should be noted that if the latest Baker and O'Brien marginal and average cost estimates are correct, and the refiners are able to pass the marginal cost on to consumers in the form of higher gasoline prices, as implied by their study, the refiners can make a profit from Tier 3. They could sell gasoline for 6 to 9 cents per gallon more while incurring only a 2.1 cent per gallon average cost increase. If this is the case, it seems odd that refiners would oppose Tier 3. There's another study cost has been performed by MathPro Incorporated for the International Council on Clean Transportation that has more realistic estimates of investment cost and annual capital cost. The MathPro study calculates an increase in average U.S. refining costs for reducing the sulfur content in gasoline of at most 1.4 cents per gallon. This result is close to the EPA's estimate of about 1 cent per gallon. The difference between the oil industry's 2.1 cent per gallon estimate and MathPro Inc.'s 1.4 cent per gallon estimate can be explained almost entirely based on the difference between the annual capital cost estimates in the two studies. Third, when Tier 3 goes into effect in 2017, there may be no increase in gasoline prices for the American consumer. Removing sulfur from the diesel fuel will increase the production costs for refineries by a small amount, but there's no certainty that this incremental cost will result on higher retail prices. The retail prices are determined by many factors, and it's impossible to tell to what extent these costs will be passed through. It is also important to note that the likely increase in the average cost of refining the low-sulfur gasoline is probably in the vicinity of 1 cent per gallon. Even if this cost were passed through to consumers, the increase in gas prices would hardly be felt. Fourth and finally, the increased refining costs associated with reducing the sulfur content of gasoline are likely to be more than offset by environmental and health benefits that will be realized from Tier 3. Tier 3 will decrease emissions of nitrogen oxides that are responsible for countless health and environmental problems, including asthma, ground-level ozone, acid rain, and damage to soil, just to name a few. For the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions alone, the annual health benefits by 2018 are estimated to be in an area of health benefits are estimated to be in the neighborhood of $235 million, which are expected to rise to $1.2 billion over time. Further, the improvement in health will result in a more productive workforce, which will lead to a more productive economy. Tier 3 will also generate economic benefits in the auto and emission control industries. It will increase jobs and provide value added due to the implementation of new technologies. I haven't fully evaluated these yet, but my preliminary analysis indicates that these benefits will greatly exceed the cost. Thank you again and for allowing me to appear here.
Thank you, Dr. Schenck, and again, thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today, and I yield myself 5 minutes for questions. We've heard a lot today discussing the issue of demand, a lot about supply, and in particular, some of our colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle believe that perhaps demand can address the price of gasoline, but supply is no part of that equation. A couple of weeks ago, we had Secretary Chu from the Department of Energy here, and I asked a question about whether or not the release that President Obama made last year from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve impacted price. And Secretary Chu said, I think the supply did make a difference. And we talked about the lifting of the moratorium in 2008 by President Bush when the price of oil dropped $9. And then the price of what happened when the SPRO was released, it was even 2 times more than the SPRO was released, its impact on the price. And he said that is true. My next question was, if long-term decreased demand has an effect on price, then don't basic laws of supply and demand dictate that so will long-term increased supplies? And he said, I absolutely agree. And then the next question, if you increase supply, it will decrease cost. That's what you have admitted to. That is what the SPRO did. Is that correct? That was a question to the Secretary of Energy. And Secretary Chu said, I agree that both supply and demand matter. Now, we've heard people say that supply doesn't matter. We've heard people testify that supply has no impact. Mr. Burkhart, in your testimony, I don't know if you were able to pick out in Dr. Rahm's testimony, he talked about only by reducing demand can the U.S. lower prices at the pump. And I do have a couple of questions for you on that. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, both demand and supply set the price. It's not one or the other, but it is indeed both. There's a mix of factors that push prices up. There's a mix of factors that push prices down, and the net result is what we see in the price of oil.
Dr. Rahm says that U.S. demand has decreased while U.S. production has increased over the past few years, yet oil and fuel prices have continued on an upward trajectory over that same time period. Do supply and demand data only from the U.S. Explain the global price of oil?
No, they don't, but because it is a global market, as has been discussed here, and both the demand trends in the U.S. and the supply trends in the U.S. Have had a big impact. The U.S. is the biggest oil consumer. It's the third largest oil producer. If you look at supply, U.S. liquids production has increased 1.3 million barrels per day in the last 3 years. That's by far the largest increase of any country in the world.
Well, then, do you agree then that more U.S. oil production won't help lower prices?
That more production won't.
Will not.
It's in more supply. Well, economic logic would dictate that more supply at a given level of demand would be a force to lower prices.
And so, any clue what if the U.S. was not the third highest producer in the world, what prices would be?
If we didn't have that supply growth, this great revival in U.S. oil production, I talked about how tight the market is right now. If we did not have that supply growth, we would probably be faced with an even tighter market today and probably higher prices.
So if you're releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to impact price, then it makes sense then to have long-term policies in place to increase overall U.S. supplies as good, solid policy.
Yeah, short-term or long-term supply does matter, just like demand does.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, some have said that oil companies are sitting on millions of acres of land but not producing any oil from their leases. What are the problems with that characterization, in your opinion?
Mr. Chairman, there are many problems with that. Number one, it defies economic logic. Companies have to pay substantial amounts of money to get these leases. They have to pay a lot of money to maintain them every year. They have a lot of expenses in studies and surveys before they can ever go out and try to even apply for a permit to drill. The idea that companies just sit on an asset just to drain money out of the corporation is ridiculous. And I talked about in my testimony, in my written testimony, how difficult it is and what length of period of time it takes to get a permit from the federal government versus state permitting agencies. The amount of red tape and the studies and reviews that have to be gone through to be able to move forward on federal land are not comparable to states. So I really take offense at people who say they're just sitting on this stuff and not making use of it. There's always work to be done in the continuum.
And with that objection, I would enter into the record a letter from Stephen Allred at the United States Department of Interior discussing the federal government's policy when it comes to using leases and the difficulty that it takes in order to move forward with the lease and achieve a permit. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of us understand that oil is traded on the global market, and therefore prices are established based on global supply and demand, in addition to other geopolitical factors. I think that this panel and the prior panel, I don't think there's any disagreement to that. A number of prominent oil and energy economists have indicated that tensions with Iran, increased demand from China and India, reduced production in Libya, and growing optimism about global economic growth are all contributing to rising oil prices. Mr. Rahm, in your testimony, you state that the only way to protect Americans from rising gasoline prices and global oil fluctuations is by implementing an aggressive strategy to reduce the country's demand for oil. You cite measures such as steadily increasing vehicle fuel efficiency and finding alternative fuels to power our automobiles. Given your conclusions, do you believe that either of the two bills under consideration will have any noticeable impact on U.S. gasoline prices? And if not, what type of policies and programs should Congress be pursuing in order to resolve this yearly, almost monotonous debate on how to address these rising gasoline prices?
Thanks for that question. No, I don't believe either of the bills in question could substantially or noticeably affect gasoline prices. I want to clear up something about what I was trying to say in my testimony. I don't think that an aggressive energy efficiency strategy, fuel economy standards, and alternative fuels would substantially lower prices. I don't, again, the price of oil is set on the world market, and demand is really being driven by countries like India and China. What we can do, however, is reduce fuel bills, which is the product of the price and the amount that you use personally, let's say through your vehicle, or that the economy uses per dollar of GDP. So the goal, if you're trying to reduce the country's vulnerability to an oil shock, price spike that's out of our control because of what happens in the Middle East or somewhere else, is to reduce the amount of oil that an individual uses when they drive their car. And that's what the President has done with the aggressive fuel economy standards he has put on the table. And I think it was Representative Waxman who cited this new EIA analysis, which showed that even though we have record gasoline prices, consumers are not seeing record fuel bills because their vehicles are considerably more efficient than they were the last time gasoline prices were very high. So the goal, if you want to make the economy more resilient to the inevitable rising prices driven by other countries and the inevitable price spikes driven by disasters or conflict in other countries, is to make this country less dependent on oil consumption, decrease oil intensity by making our cars more efficient and by finding substitutes for oil.
Of any independent, peer-reviewed studies that conclude that EPA regulations have harmed U.S. competitiveness? And conversely, are you aware of any independent studies that suggest that EPA regulations have boosted our competitiveness by giving us market leadership in cleaner technologies?
Well, it's a good question. I discussed it somewhat in the testimony. I think it's quite clear that there really are no independent studies that find that EPA regulations have hurt U.S. competitiveness. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious in the case of gasoline. Most of our trading competitors, whether it's Japan or Germany or Great Britain, tax gasoline at a very high level. I mean, if you've been to Europe, you know they're paying $2, $3, $4 a gallon more for gasoline than we are. So some regulation that might affect U.S. gasoline prices by a penny or 2 pennies can't possibly hurt U.S. competitiveness when they're paying, $2, $3, $4 a gallon more than we are. What I do think you'll find in the literature is that U.S. leadership on clean energy standards, particularly in the automotive industry, created leadership in pollution control technology, catalytic converters. And in fact, the low sulfur standards, ironically, have allowed U.S. Diesel producers to sell diesel into the European market because it now meets their standard. So I think in general, it's always good. The world is moving towards cleaner energy and lower emissions. The countries that do it first become leaders in the technology, and they create jobs exporting that technology.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smorch, each of the regulations that would be included in the study would require a refiner to spend capital. What is it like to face these types of capital improvements? Is it easy to arrange for loans, engineering design services, construction permitting, and other steps that may be required to comply?
That's a great question. One of the things that we look at, like I said before in my testimony, is I look at where cash and credit is going to be available over a 10-year period. And these regulations come one after the other, it seems like. So I'm looking at trying to deal with capital for multiple regulations at one time. Okay? For small business refiners in this type of an economy, there are some out there that would have a hard time being able to get the credit and raise and to be able to go and comply with regulation. There's an example for renewable fuel standard. 13 small business refiners got an exemption, an additional 2-year exemption, because it was a burden for them. So that just shows that these are burdensome regulations.
Yeah. If a small refiner is forced out of business, how does that impact the local economy? I know that when small coal operations are forced out, it impacts my district tremendously. What happens when a small refiner is forced out in the local economy, particularly a rural economy?
For small companies like CountryMark, we do mostly operate in rural communities. In Posey County, Indiana, we're the second biggest employer in the county. And as I testified, we have about a $2.5 billion per year economic impact. Other small refiners are similar to that they're typically located in rural areas that are remote. They tend to be the biggest employers and have the most economic impact in their areas.
And so that then affects the car salesman, the refrigerator salesman, the Long John Silver's, the McDonald's, et cetera.
Yeah, it's going to affect everybody in the community. When you lose a big employer in any community, it goes away forever.
Yeah.
And you can never recover. Those communities have a hard time recovering in the long term.
That's why a lot of folks in my district are concerned about the whole array of new regulations. Do you have any examples where different rules would either overlap or contradict each other in regard to your business?
You know, there was a lot of talk about Tier 3 rules and all that, and EPA hasn't really proposed them yet. But I was able to go and sit on a small business advocacy panel. And so I got to see what they were going to propose. The sulfur standards for me is that CountryMark, we just completed construction of our low sulfur gasoline unit to comply with Tier 2 just a couple of years ago. Now we're faced with going and modifying that same equipment and going and to meet a 10 part per million standard. Well, it would have been better for us and more efficient if we would have known that ahead of time, because now we have to go and rearrange the equipment we just bought. And I don't even know if we can recoup the cost of that modification or not in the marketplace. So it does have a vulnerability. So for me, that's two regulations that kind of stack on top of each other and really cause us problems in the long term.
And for some businesses, maybe not yours, but for some businesses, you start doing that stacking, you collapse the business and they go out of business.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Mr. Ennis, let me ask you, talking about small businesses, many small businesses and what I would call micro businesses, the ones that have one or two folks, mom and pop operations, are owned by low-income persons who are struggling to work their way to a better life. They're taking a risk. They've opened up a business. What is the impact of high gasoline prices on small businesses such as this?
The impact of high gas prices or high electricity prices are dramatic. It stifles economic mobility for these entrepreneurs and these small businesses. Just one quick statistic, the average family right now spends 5% of their disposable income on energy costs. Lower income, 20%. If you fall below the poverty level, 50% of your income. That means if you fall below the poverty level, before you wake up in the morning, half your income is gone, is soaked by high energy prices. That means that's income not available for health care, for education, for food, for shelter. And forget entrepreneurship, forget investing in this great idea that you might have as a potential entrepreneur. So it stifles economic mobility, and that's why we consider this fight for affordable access for affordable energy as the final frontier for the civil rights revolution.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back, and I have three things for the record without objection. would enter into the record the analysis of the Tier 3 sulfur rule conducted by Baker and O'Brien for the American Petroleum Institute, a letter of support for the Gasoline Regulations Act from the American Fuel and Petrochemicals Manufacturers, and a letter of support for the Gasoline Regulations Act from the National Biodiesel Board. Recognize Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. I wanted to start with Mr. Smorts. Just real quick, how is your business doing? Is it doing okay?
Yeah, our business is fine, and one of the things that when you work for a cooperative, we share in our profits with 100,000 farmers. That basically our profits end up going and are shared out in the rural areas of our marketing area. So for us, we're sharing in profit with 100,000 farmers that are going out using that money to increase their business.
Well, I commend you for doing that, and I just wanted to make the point that the upgrades that you needed to implement in response to Tier 2 haven't prevented the business from doing well and still having profits that it can distribute, and I would expect you to be able to handle the Tier 3 requirements as well. I'd like to ask Mr. Coleman, you suggested you were offended at the notion that the people would have leases issued to them and permits and would not then take advantage of those to produce on the land. Are you questioning the fact that there are a substantial number of permits and leases that have been issued in instances where production has not yet occurred?
Congressman, I'm offended at the misrepresentation of the situation. Leases are out there. They're working on these leases all the time. It's not possible to drill them all at once because of the process that you have to go through to do the analysis of the lease. You get a lease, you may do more analysis, more 3D seismic surveys, and that takes a while to do. It takes money to finance that. It takes the availability of seismic crews to be able to shoot that seismic. You may have permits, but those may be in litigation. There's a lot of different...
Well, I've sat through a lot of hearings in the Natural Resources Committee. I've heard endless testimony on this question. And I've gotten pretty comfortable with the idea that there are a substantial number of situations in which there's nothing preventing the industry from developing, producing, and so forth, these leases that they have, and yet they haven't proceeded forward. So I'm equally offended by the notion that that these resources would be available, particularly given all the arguments that you're making about how we have to increase supply and that the industry would not be pursuing them. But I'm going to run out of time, so I need to turn to Dr. Rome, who I want to thank for your testimony. You put together a terrific set of bullet points about sort of 6 key points that you wanted to see, and I wanted to first echo your observation about the benefits that EPA regulations offer us in terms of public health in particular. I've just lost it on my iPad, but there's an article that I was referring to earlier which showed great expectations in Maryland about the benefits that would come from Tier 3 in terms of reducing these nitrogen oxides and the health benefits that would follow, reducing smog and so forth, and you know, limiting the amount of sulfur that's coming from the gas is one of the most effective ways to impact the pollution out there. But you also made 2 points that I thought are intriguing given the purpose of the legislation that was put through here with respect to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. You noted there's broad agreement among energy experts and economists that increasing domestic oil production will have no noticeable impact on U.S. gas prices for the foreseeable future. And then you also indicated there's only one demonstrated way to reduce gasoline prices in the short term, and that is release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And as I understand the legislation, the second piece that we're discussing here today, it says that you can't go take action with respect to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve until you put more of these lands into production. So essentially it's saying you can't go do the one thing that will work until you go do the thing that won't work, which doesn't make any sense to me, and I think really sort of undermines the inherent logic of that particular legislation. With that, I yield back my time.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. And actually, the legislation that's before us, the Strategic Energy Production Act, doesn't tie the hands of the president whatsoever in order to access or release energy from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. In fact, it's very clear that the president may continue to make the decision under any circumstances that comply with the law to release energy from the SPRO. So the president can continue just as they always have, as long as they meet and comply with the conditions of the law that allow for the SPRO release to occur in the first place. But if that happens, and I believe what we've heard today, what we've heard in other places, is that what we've heard in other witnesses testify today.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
You just recognize yourself for an additional 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, we're doing another round? I'm sorry.
You want to do another round? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
I didn't understand that. Yeah, we can do another round.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. I had a conversation with Mr. Rush, and that's why we switched out. I apologize for that. But anyway, so the conversations we've had all point to the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve causing prices to go down 4 cents a gallon for a maximum amount of time of a week or so because of the infusion of supply into the marketplace. And it makes sense then if you infuse the marketplace with supply, that supply then matters. And so instead of a quick fix to supply by going into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, why don't we have a long-term supply policy of increasing domestic production so that we can actually reduce the price long-term instead of just for a week or so? So I think the conversation about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the very point of the conversation is that increasing supply decreases price. So if we increase that supply, we'll decrease price, and that's long-term as well as short-term. And with that being said, I wanted to get back to this issue of leases on federal lands. I know Mr. Abbey in the previous panel had talked about the number of acres that are under federal leases that may or may not be under active production. And again, I refer to the letter that I entered into the record from Mr. Stephen Allred, the Assistant Secretary of Lands and Minerals Management. This is a letter to Don Young, ranking Republican member then in 2008 on the Committee on Natural Resources. And the letter makes reference to the fact that you have a lease doesn't mean that you have production opportunity. It means that you may not have production opportunities to go forward with. And the letter specifically says that the existence of a lease does not guarantee the discovery of or any particular quantity of oil and gas. Mr. Coleman, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Leasing happens based on a general analysis of the area. Then once you get a lease, you do a more specific analysis of the specific leases that you have. That is based on additional seismic surveys rather than potentially a 2D seismic survey, which would be used for a less expensive seismic survey used to get the lease, and you do a 3D seismic survey to determine whether you really looks like you have something there to go after. That takes a while, as I explained in my previous statement. And there are many other hoops that you have to jump through. You have to do surveys in with endangered species before you go out and apply for permits. There are many, many stages to go through. This is not a static situation. Just because there's not drilling doesn't mean there's not activity. To say, as previous testimony says, they're sitting on the leases, they're not active on the leases, that is not the case.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. And Mr. Burkhart, in your opinion, would it be responsible to initiate a SPRO drawdown right now in the face of what could be an extreme supply emergency caused by Iran?
Given the potential for what could happen, and again, the oil market is very tense. There's a very limited cushion of spare capacity. The situation with Iran, there's many scenarios we could come up with which could be startling to the oil market. So The SPRO is intended as a response to a large supply disruption, and we haven't had one yet.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt. And to your knowledge, has the SPRO been refilled? The amount of oil that was taken out last year, has it been replaced?
I think it stands at 696 million barrels, which is below what it was last year.
And are you aware of any plans to refill that if there's access to the SPRO this summer?
I'm not aware of any plans.
And so if there is a extreme supply emergency caused by some kind of international conflict, right now there's no plan to actually fill the SPRO back up to capacity. In fact, Congress has approved the SPRO to go up to a billion barrels, but it's almost 300 million below that as it currently stands. It's even lower than capacity at this point, correct?
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt. And the chair now recognizes Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I ask a question, I'd ask unanimous consent to, without objection, to submit 2 letters to the record. One's from the Consumer Union, the other's from a coalition of environmental groups, both addressing the legislation that we're looking at
without
here today.
objection.
Thank you. This debate over whether we're using the lands that have already been leased, we could probably go on all night with it. But I just want to point out some statistics here. Again, reiterate that between fiscal year 09 and fiscal year 11, the Bureau of Land Management approved almost 14,000 applications for a permit to drill. But as of the end of 2011, had yet to begin production on over 7,000 of them, more than half that had been approved. They had yet to begin production. And overall, of the nearly 39 million acres that are currently under lease to oil and gas companies onshore, only about 13 million, or less than a third, are actually in production. Now, I understand your points that you take a snapshot, it may not capture what's going on behind the scenes, that the industry is making judgments about, which leases are the most important to pursue and what's involved in doing it. So that, it may be that if only a third of the acreage is in production at a given time, that doesn't mean that the other 2/3 is being completely ignored. But to suggest that we're not making lands, public lands, available to the industry to pursue in the context of this idea that we have to increase supply, when 2/3, at least on the surface, appear not to be actively in production, I think is sort of pushing the question here. And so, again, I don't want to debate it because we're not going to solve it here today, but I think it's a legitimate point that's being made about the number of acres that are actually out there that have yet to be put into production. Why don't you respond? I don't want you to feel like you're not getting a chance to respond to this because I've
well, Congressman, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to your comments. This is a very complicated question. Just to give you for the BLM to give a statistic, okay, this is how much percentage of acreage or how many permits are not being used. I assume they didn't tell you how many of those permits have been litigated, what other kind of problems there might be with some of these areas. These are not static. Litigation comes, it can come.
Well, I'll tell you what, because I'm going to run. I will commit to you that I'm going to make this a project of mine to find out the answers to those questions that you're raising.
And there are other questions too.
I'm sure there are, and we'll make sure we vet them all. But I'm betting that won't fully respond to the observation that these are not being utilized to the extent they could at a time when we need to increase production. And I'm gonna have to move on. I just wanted to ask Mr. Schenck if you could speak. You talked about in your testimony, but speak to the benefits. Well, 2 things. There's the specter raised that if we have the Tier 3 regulations as we envision they might be, because they haven't actually been proposed yet, but if they went into effect, that it would have this substantial impact on the price of gas, and you already spoke to how modest that would be, if at all, if it got passed on at all. If you could reiterate that, and then also allude again to the benefits in terms of health and protecting the health of the public.
Yes, I think the reliable estimates are that the cost increase the refiners will face is somewhere in the neighborhood of a penny a gallon, and I think there's no guarantee that that will necessarily get passed through, because the refining industry is highly competitive, and it's whether or not they're able to pass it on is not clear. But even if they are, it's only a penny. So I think that there's been a lot of skies falling going on, and based on numbers that are too high and not justified. And I think it's a small effect, if any. But I think and I'm glad I ran out of time at the end. But the benefits that come from this in the environmental and health area, I think, are probably some of the most important. The purpose of the regulations are to improve health and environment, and I think this will go a long way. In the Mid-Atlantic area, the emissions from motor vehicles of nitrogen oxide it's the highest source of that, and this is a cost-effective way of trying to reduce it, and the benefits can be very large. I think we both cited the same numbers from this one study, and that's one area. The amount of emissions that are in the other areas are 2 or 3 times that much, so the benefits in these other areas could be 2 or 3 times the numbers for the Northeast region. So rather than 1.2 billion, it could be 3, 4, 5 billion if once we get through it. I haven't done the studies yet. I'm not saying that's the number, but I think it could be very big.
The gentleman's time has expired. If you could wrap it up, please. Thank you.
Okay. There are benefits because of the health benefits of people that be more productive, and this is also very much pro-industry. We have a very strong emission control industry and auto industry. They have leadership in this, and this will be a chance for them to show their stuff again and generate jobs and investment by moving to meet these standards.
Gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Schenck, thank you. And the chair recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much, and I would like to welcome all the witnesses, and I'm sorry that I had to leave for a while, but we genuinely appreciate your being here. And Mr. Myers, let me ask you a question or two. I know you've spent quite a bit of time over at EPA, and Mrs. McCarthy indicated that it was very difficult for them to analyze the cumulative effect of the rules in our bill. And just from your experience at EPA, do you think that they have the necessary tools to review the cumulative impact of the regulations that we set out in our legislation?
Well, I think in any economic analysis that you do, you need to make certain assumptions. So they're going to have to make some assumptions. That would be clear. But in different ways that are currently done, you do sensitivity analysis, you do different analysis of different proposals, alternative proposals. So I don't see that as insurmountable. You could basically, using current data, effectively do a range of proposals as to what you think they might be, and do that prospectively. Plus, I think I noted in the discussion draft there's a limitation saying it's not required to go beyond available data. So I think it's a doable option. It's just whether they want to do it.
Well, did you hear her testimony today? Did you hear the question and answers with Ms. McCarthy?
I was here during the hearing, yes.
Was there anything else that she may have made a comment about that you would like to comment on?
Well, I think there was basically, I referenced it in my oral. I was just saying, if Tier 3 is limited to sulfur, that's one thing. There are other authorities in the Clean Air Act regarding fuels that could also have an effect on the marketplace in the next 5 years. Secondly, although when we were talking about the changes on the ozone standard and the authority in the ozone standard, I would make two observations. One, they're not inside the Act. They don't amend directly the standard setting provision that's inside the Clean Air Act, so that still remains. That being said, it's still other statutory law talking about cost and feasibility. What I think I tried to point out in my testimony is that EPA examines those issues now in terms of cost of the standards, in terms of possible implementation scenarios. But what we have is a situation where you're effectively saying to the administrator, put blinders on, don't look at the man behind the curtain, and try to make this decision. There are other ways of doing it. The Safe Drinking Water Act, for example, has two concepts in it: MCLG, which is a goal, and basically a limitation level. So they decide what the goal is. And the last thing I thought in the written testimony was, and NACs were actually referred in the written testimony as a goal. They're not a goal; they're a standard. And I think any state that puts together a SIP or any federal implementation plan that's trying to implement a standard knows it's a standard. So I think there's a way around it. What I think the legislation is looking for is a balancing of factors and allowing the administrator to look at cost and feasibility. It's a big change. I don't think there's any way of getting around saying it's a big change, but it's something that could be supportable by looking at other statutes.
Well, we're getting ready to have some forums on the Clean Air Act simply because it has not been really reviewed in quite a while, and there have been some unintended consequences with the Clean Air Act, and we're looking forward to having these forums to have people come in on all sides of the issue to determine, is the Clean Air Act working the way it was really intended to work today, and we'll be getting into that later on. Mr. Smorch, let me just ask one question. How many refineries are you involved in?
Countrymark only owns and operates one refinery.
Okay. Now, have you estimated the potential impacts of the regulation on gas and diesel prices from EPA's pending rules? And if so, what would the range of increases be?
Yeah, earlier I mentioned that we're able to share our profits with our members who represent 100,000 farmers in our area. And I thought that was the point of this regulation, or the legislation, the Gasoline Regulations Act, to go and look at regulation and how the cumulative effect is going to affect our business. My job is to try to preserve that we can go and still provide that in return to our member owners. When I look at the range, and if you look in my written testimony, there's a chart on page 11 that basically, depending on how regulation is developed, it can be as low as 8 to 13 cents a gallon and as high as 39 to 61 cents a gallon, depending on how all the regulations stack on top of each other. That is an extreme expense that we either have to absorb or is going to have to get transferred to the consumer.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ennis, if I might ask you a few questions. One of the concerns that I have with so many of the regulations that have been proposed by the EPA is that coming from a district that does not have great wealth, we have a few places that are wealthier than others, but we have some really poor areas in particular. I sense that there are actually public health concerns with all these regulations, and I'm wondering if you can comment on that, and do you share that concern?
Well, I think what's very important for this committee and others to recognize is that economic sustainability for these communities that are affected by these regulations should be part of the health consideration as well. What high energy costs represent on poor people in particular and working class Americans is the most vicious regressive tax. As I said before, when you've got to spend a disproportionate amount of your income, be you a small family or be you a small business, on high energy costs, that takes away income that could be made available for other things, including health care. So I think what is very important, I think it's what there's no question that the regulations that have gone into effect over the last several decades have helped the American people. It's helped the environment. It's helped the health of the American people. The question is, at what point is there diminishing returns? At what point, I mean, do you attempt to achieve some type of balance where you realize how much more regulation do you want to put on a particular industry, and what kind of negative impact potentially could it have on the economies of communities?
And do I hear from your testimony and from your comments today that you believe we are at that point of diminishing returns, at least in the current economic situation that we're in?
Well, if you just look at the sulfur rule, and forgive me for not knowing the technical designation, but I believe that the bill or the regulation that was passed in 2000 and implemented in 2004 said you have to regulate emissions, sulfur emissions, up to 95%. I mean, how much more regulation do you want to implement on top of that? And I think that's the question that this committee has to ask. I believe I've heard on several occasions that the EPA is not allowed to look at economic impacts on communities, all American communities. Forget lower income communities, but all communities. So I think this committee, as a representative of the people, has the moral responsibility to look at those economic impacts.
And I would agree with you on that. I worry about folks on fixed incomes in my district having to heat to a minimal level one room in their house during the wintertime. And when I asked the EPA if they took that into consideration as part of their health, Lisa Jackson was here last year, and I said, did you take that into consideration when you were looking at the health concerns related to greenhouse gases? The response was, well, we have programs to help those people. Unfortunately, my folks tell me that while it may help the very poorest of the poor, they don't have enough money in those programs to help the working poor and some of the folks who are on fixed income, that it does help the very poorest of the poor, but there are a lot of folks who are not caught in that safety net who then find themselves having to make sacrifices or, as you said, do we pay for health care or do we pay for heat? And fortunately, we've had a very mild winter, but when you don't have natural gas into every area of the district, when you have a lot of folks using electricity and those rates have gone up substantially, and you have folks who are using oil to heat their homes, this becomes a very serious health concern, in my opinion. I appreciate that. Last but not least, and it's somewhat of a rhetorical question because I already know the answer, but do you see electric cars and other green energy alternatives a viable option, at least today, for low-income households?
No. That dog is just not going to hunt in lower income communities. But I would argue, though, that the reason we really need to examine these regulations and the impact that they have on all energies, be they renewable or traditional sources of energy, is that even if you can afford the volt to recharge the battery has to be plugged in and has to use electricity. In today's Washington, I believe it was today's Washington Post, it said that some recent EPA regulations, I believe that were released yesterday,
yes, sir,
are going to cause coal-powered generated power plants, no new ones to be built for the next 10 years. This is while our largest economic competitor, China, is building 2 per week. What kind of impact is that going to have on electricity, which is going to have on the ability of someone who can afford that Volt vehicle and needs to plug in to recharge it? What kind of impact is that going to have on the feasibility of this alternative vehicle?
And I think you're submitting that it would have a negative impact, and I would completely agree with you. Thank you. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you again for your time to be here today. I appreciate your testimony, and that concludes today's committee.